You are doing something right now that no physical theory can fully explain. You are reading these words. Light is hitting your retina. Photoreceptors fire. Signals travel along the optic nerve, reach the visual cortex, get processed into shapes and letters and meaning. We can describe all of that in extraordinary detail. We can trace the exact path of each signal, name every neurotransmitter, chart every neural cascade, right down to the individual ion channel, opening at the right millisecond. The machinery is extraordinary, and we understand it with growing precision. What we cannot explain is why any of it is accompanied by the feeling of reading, why there is something it is like to take in these words, why the redness of an apple is not merely a wavelength of 700 nanometers bouncing off a surface and triggering a cascade of neural events, but is also that specific, irreducible quality of red that you have carried with you since childhood, the experience, the inside of the thing. Philosophers call these qualities qualia, the hard problem of consciousness, a name coined by the philosopher David Chalmers in his 1995 paper published in the Journal of Consciousness Studies, is simply this. Why does the physical processing of information feel like anything at all? Why doesn't it all just happen in the dark? Now add to this a second puzzle. Tonight, when you sleep, your brain will enter a phase of activity so bizarre that the researchers who first described it in 1953 named it paradoxical sleep. Your brain will burn nearly as much energy as it does right now. Your eyes will dart back and forth beneath your closed lids. Your body will be paralyzed by signals descending from your brainstem. And in the middle of all this metabolic intensity, you will fabricate an entire world. People, places, conversations, stories, emotions, all of it generated from nothing. All of it apparently real to the person experiencing it. You will be conscious inside a world that does not exist. And when you wake, in most cases, you will have no reliable memory of most of it. The experience will have been vivid. The trace will be almost nothing. These two puzzles, what consciousness is and what dreaming tells us about it, have been treated largely as separate problems. The neuroscience of sleep runs in one set of journals, the philosophy of mind in another, the quantum physicists in a third. But a growing number of researchers believe that keeping them separate is the foundational mistake. To understand what dreaming is, you need a real theory of consciousness. To build a real theory of consciousness, you may need to go below the level of neurons, below the biochemistry, below classical physics, all the way to the quantum substrate of matter itself. This is a video about that possibility, and I want to be honest with you from the start. It is not a claim that science has solved the hard problem. It has not. What I will do is walk you through the genuine scientific and philosophical landscape honestly, tracking what is known, what is contested, and what remains wide open. The territory is strange enough without embellishment. Part 1. The standard story. Let us begin where every introductory neuroscience course begins, with the comfortable version of how the brain produces consciousness and dreams. Not because it is wrong, much of it is right, but because understanding precisely where it succeeds is what lets us locate precisely where it fails. The brain contains roughly 86 billion neurons. Each neuron is a cell, and like all cells, it operates on classical biochemistry. Ions moving across membranes through protein channels, neurotransmitters docking at receptors, electrical potentials rising and falling according to the Hodgkin-Huxley equations that Alan Hodgkin and Andrew Huxley derived in 1952, for which they received the Nobel Prize in Physiology 11 years later. The average neuron connects to somewhere between 1,000 and 10,000 other neurons through structures called synapses, which means that across the entire brain there are something in the range of 100 trillion synaptic connections. The pattern of activity across this network at any given moment, which neurons are firing, at what rate, in what temporal sequences and synchronization patterns, is the neural correlate of whatever you are experiencing. Consciousness, in the dominant view among neuroscientists, emerges from this activity. It is what a sufficiently complex and organized information processing system does. The view has many names: physicalism, materialism, computational, functionalism. But they share a core commitment. There is no ghost in the machine. Everything you feel, think, remember, and experience arises from neurons firing in organized patterns. If you could read out all of the relevant neural activity in real time, down to every synapse and ion concentration, you would find the complete physical basis of your inner life. The brain does not need anything beyond classical physics to produce consciousness. Complexity, organized in the right way, is enough. The neuroscience of sleep fits neatly into this story. Human sleep divides into cycles that repeat roughly every 90 minutes throughout the night. Within each cycle, the brain moves through stages defined by their EEG signatures, non-REM stages, characterized by progressively slower and higher amplitude brainwaves, followed by a period of REM sleep. Eugene Asarinsky, a graduate student at the University of Chicago, working in Nathaniel Kleitman's laboratory, first noticed the rapid eye movements that define REM sleep in 1953, and the discovery that these periods were associated with dreaming transformed sleep science overnight. REM sleep was also called paradoxical sleep by the French physiologist Michel Jouvet because its EEG looked paradoxically like waking, low amplitude, high frequency, rather than the slow waves of deep sleep. During REM, the pons sends pontogeniculo-occipital waves up through the thalamus into the visual cortex. The same pathways that process visual information from the retina are activated by internal signals, with no sensory input required. The visual cortex fires to internally generated patterns and interprets these patterns as visual experience because that is what visual cortex activation means to the brain, regardless of source. The motor cortex also activates, but descending signals from the pons inhibit the spinal motor neurons, producing the muscle atonia of REM sleep. You dream of running, but your muscles do not move. Failures of this inhibition produce REM sleep behavior disorder, strongly associated with later Parkinson's disease. The limbic system, the amygdala, hippocampus, anterior cingulate, is highly active during REM, which explains why dreams carry emotional weight disproportionate to their content. The prefrontal cortex, associated with rational evaluation and reality testing, shows reduced activation, which explains why dream narrative goes unchallenged. You do not notice you are flying because the part of the brain that would notice is, for the duration, quiet. Francis Crick and Christoph Koch proposed in a series of papers through the 1990s and 2000 that the neural correlates of consciousness are associated especially with gamma frequency oscillations, brainwaves cycling between 30 and 90 times per second. Synchronized gamma firing across widely distributed brain regions binds disparate features, shape, color, identity, emotion, into unified conscious experience. In 2014, Ursula Voss and colleagues published in Nature Neuroscience showing that weak electrical stimulation at 40 Hertz, precisely the gamma range, reliably triggered lucid dreaming in sleeping subjects. Gamma input seems to boot up frontal metacognitive systems within the ongoing REM dream, stimulate at 40 Hz, and the dreamer becomes aware that they are dreaming. So the standard story has genuine power. Gamma waves bind information into unified experience, and their induction triggers self-awareness in dreams. REM sleep activates sensory processing while blocking sensory input and motor output. The brainstem orchestrates the choreography. None of this is wrong. But here is where the standard story runs into its wall. Describing the neural correlates of consciousness is not explaining why those brain states are accompanied by experiences at all. We can map the correlates with growing precision. What we cannot do is derive the qualitative character of experience from the physical description. We cannot explain why gamma oscillations at 40 Hz feel like anything rather than simply happening in the dark. The hard problem is still there, and complexity alone has not bridged the gap between the physical and the experiential in the 150 years since scientists began taking the brain seriously. Part 2. What classical physics cannot do. Classical physics describes the behavior of objects through deterministic or statistical laws. Everything in the classical framework is, at bottom, information processing, definite states transitioning according to fixed rules. A thermostat processes information. A calculator processes information. A brain in the classical view processes information. And here is the question that does not go away. Would a perfect simulation of a brain feel anything? Would there be something it is like to be the simulation? Most philosophers who take the hard problem seriously say that functional equivalence is not enough. David Chalmers introduced the philosophical zombie as a thought experiment, a being physically and functionally identical to you in every way, but with no inner experience. The The zombie is not a claim that such beings exist. It is a probe of whether experience is logically entailed by physical description. If a zombie is conceivable, and to most who consider the question carefully, it seems conceivable, then experience is not guaranteed by the physical description. The gap is not empirical, it is conceptual. Thomas Nagel made a related point in his 1974 paper, What is it like to be a bat? One of the most cited papers in 20th century philosophy. A bat navigates by echolocation. It emits ultrasonic pulses and processes the returning echoes to build a three-dimensional map of its environment. We understand the neuroscience of bat echolocation in considerable detail. We know which brain regions process which frequencies, how the auditory cortex encodes spatial information from the timing and frequency shifts of returning echoes, how motor control coordinates the pulses with the bat's movements. What we cannot know, Nagel argued, is what it is like to experience the world through echolocation. The subjective character of bat experience, the phenomenology, is inaccessible to us because it depends not just on having the information, but on having it in the form that it is in for the bat. There is something it is like to be a bat navigating by echolocation that is not captured by any third-person description of the bat's neural activity. And if this is true for bat echolocation, it is equally true for human consciousness. The third-person description of neural activity, however complete, does not capture what it is like to be the system. The philosopher Frank Jackson sharpened this with the Mary's Room thought experiment, published in 1982 in the Philosophical Quarterly. Mary is a brilliant scientist who knows everything there is to know about the physics and neuroscience of colour vision. She has studied every wavelength, every photoreceptor, every cortical processing stage, every linguistic report that seeing red produces. But she has spent her entire life in a black and white room with only black and white input. When Mary finally leaves the room and sees red for the first time, she learns something new, what red looks like. She learns the experiential character of red. But if she already knew all the physical facts, and she learned something new, then the experiential character of red is not a physical fact. Jackson later reconsidered this conclusion, but the thought experiment continues to generate discussion precisely because the intuition it targets is so powerful. There is something about what seeing red is like that resists physical description. Quantum mechanics operates on different principles from classical physics. Quantum systems before measurement exist in superpositions of multiple possible states simultaneously, described by a wave function that evolves deterministically according to the Schrödinger equation. When a measurement is made, the wave function collapses. The spread of possibilities resolves into one actual outcome. The mechanism and cause of this collapse, the measurement problem, is one of the deepest unsolved problems in physics. What counts as a measurement? When does the wave function collapse? Must there be a conscious observer? John von Neumann, in his 1932 mathematical formalization of quantum mechanics, traced the chain of physical interactions during a measurement and found no natural physical boundary at which collapse should occur. He concluded tentatively that collapse must occur at the level of the observer's consciousness. Eugene Wigner, in a 1961 paper, argued explicitly that the consciousness of the observer is required for wave function collapse and introduced the Wigner's friend thought experiment to show why this matters. These are not fringe questions. Von Neumann, Wigner, Bohr. These are the architects of quantum mechanics. The most widely accepted modern treatment is decoherence, developed by Wojciech Zurek at Los Alamos from the 1980s onward. Large objects appear classical because they interact continuously with environmental particles, entangling their quantum state with the environment and washing out quantum interference effects. But decoherence does not make the wave function collapse. In Hugh Everett's many worlds interpretation, no collapse ever occurs. Each quantum event branches into a parallel world. This removes the measurement problem at the cost of an infinite multiverse. In the Copenhagen interpretation, no description of what happens during measurement is attempted. The formalism predicts outcomes, and the demand for a deeper account is declared meaningless. Neither response is fully satisfying. The question of consciousness's role in quantum mechanics remains genuinely open. This is the philosophical and physical context in which Penrose's arguments arise. Classical physics cannot derive experience from its descriptions. The hard problem is real. Quantum mechanics has an unsolved measurement problem that some of its founders thought implicated consciousness. These two open problems, Penrose argues, are connected, and the connection runs through a specific proposal about the physics of the brain. Part 3. Penrose's argument from mathematical insight. Roger Penrose is a mathematical physicist at Oxford who proved with Stephen Hawking that singularities are necessary consequences of general relativity. He discovered Penrose tilings, are periodic patterns that tile a plane without repeating, with implications for quasi-crystal physics. He received the Nobel Prize in Physics in 2020 for his work on black holes. He is not a crank. In his 1989 book, The Emperor's New Mind, Penrose built a sustained argument that human mathematical understanding cannot be captured by any classical algorithm. The central exhibit is Kurt Gödel's incompleteness theorem, proved in 1931. Gödel showed that in any consistent formal system, powerful enough to express arithmetic, there exist true statements that cannot be proved within that system. The proof uses a clever self-reference. Gödel constructs a statement that essentially says, this statement cannot be proved in this system. If the system is consistent, free of contradictions, then the statement is true, but unprovable within the system. The system is therefore incomplete. There are truths it cannot establish. This result had a devastating implication for the program of David Hilbert, who had hoped to formalize all of mathematics in a complete and consistent axiomatic system. Gödel proved this is impossible. Every formal system powerful enough to express arithmetic has true statements it cannot prove. Add those statements as new axioms, and the extended system has its own Gödelian blind spots. Penrose's argument, human mathematicians can see the truth of Gödelian statements that the relevant formal system cannot prove. When we contemplate the Gödelian statement for some formal system, we can recognize that it must be true, even though it is not provable within the system. This insight, Penrose argues, cannot itself be the output of a classical algorithm. Any algorithm is a formal system, with its own Gödelian limitations. If the algorithm were the complete description of human mathematical cognition, then human mathematical cognition would have those same Gödelian blind spots. But it doesn't, or at least there is no evidence that it does. Human mathematicians appear to transcend the limitations of any specific formal system by stepping outside it. This transcendence, Penrose argues, cannot be algorithmic. The criticism from Jerry Fodor, Douglas Hofstadter, and others, Penrose is confusing what mathematicians can see with what they can formally prove. The recognition that a Gödelian statement is true may itself rely on informal heuristics, pattern matching, intuitions, none of which guarantee correctness, and all of which might have their own systematic limitations that we simply haven't discovered yet. Penrose has responded at length in Shadows of the Mind, arguing that even a fallible, non-algorithmic process would suffice for his purposes, because the mere possibility of Gödelian insight, even occasional, even uncertain, implies that human cognition is not purely algorithmic. The debate is sustained and unresolved. But the implication, if any feature of human cognition cannot be captured by classical computation, it must be something else, pointed Penrose toward quantum mechanics, the one place in physics where processes occur that are non-computable in the relevant sense is in the collapse of the wave function, and specifically in a version of collapse governed by the geometry of spacetime. In papers from the late 1980s through a 2014 paper in Foundations of Physics, Penrose developed his proposal. Wave function collapse is gravitational. When a quantum system is in a superposition of two states, each state corresponds to a slightly different mass distribution and therefore to a slightly different spacetime geometry. Two superposed spacetime geometries are unstable in general relativity. They represent a superposition of different curvatures of spacetime itself, and spacetime does not admit definite superpositions without violating the structure of general relativity. Penrose proposed that when the gravitational self-energy of the superposition exceeds a critical threshold, characterized by the energy scale, at which quantum mechanics and general relativity cannot both be correct simultaneously, the superposition collapses spontaneously. This is objective reduction, driven by gravity itself, requiring no external measurement. The threshold is mass and distance dependent. For a superposition at the nanometer scale of protein conformational changes, the collapse time falls in the range of milliseconds, precisely the time scale of neural activity, not by design, by the physics. Part 4. Orchestrated Objective Reduction. Stuart Hameroff came to the question of consciousness through anesthesiology and through decades spent studying the cytoskeleton of neurons. The cytoskeletal protein microtubule, a hollow tube about 25 nanometers in diameter, built from a protein called tubulin arranged in helical rows, is present in every neuron in extraordinary density, extending through axons and dendrites, connecting to synaptic spines, regulating the electrical activity of dendritic compartments. A single neuron may contain many kilometers of microtubule polymer if its length were measured end to end. The microtubular lattice of a single neuron's dendritic arbor contains millions of tubulin dimers, each a candidate quantum switch. Within each tubulin dimer, a mobile electron sits in a hydrophobic pocket, a region from which water is excluded, maintained by the protein's folded structure. The electron can occupy one of two positions within the pocket, and the protein's overall shape differs slightly depending on which position it occupies. This binary switching is information processing at the molecular scale, and the quantum mechanical nature of the electron, capable of existing in a superposition of both positions simultaneously, suggests quantum information processing at a scale and density that no silicon processor has approached. Hameroff had also spent years puzzling over the Meyer-Overton correlation, the observation discovered independently by Hans Horst Meyer and Charles Ernest Overton in 1899, that the potency of anesthetic drugs correlates almost perfectly with their lipid solubility across an enormous range of compounds. Simple gases like xenon, complex organic molecules like propofol, chlorinated hydrocarbons like halothane, all follow the same relationship, spanning a range of 5 orders of magnitude in molecular complexity. Whatever anesthetics do to abolish consciousness, they do it by dissolving in something lipophilic. The hydrophobic pockets of tubulin are precisely the kind of lipophilic environment where anesthetic agents would dissolve, and the quantum dynamics of the electron in those pockets are precisely what would be disrupted by an anesthetic molecule filling the pocket. Hameroff proposed that anesthetics abolish consciousness by penetrating these pockets and disrupting the quantum dynamics within them. Consciousness, on this view, is what those quantum dynamics do. Abolish the quantum process, and you abolish the experience. When Hameroff encountered Penrose's arguments in the early 1990s, he saw the connection immediately. Penrose needed a biological location in neurons where quantum gravitational processes, objective reductions, could occur at millisecond timescales. Hameroff had candidate structures, microtubules, present in every neuron, dynamically maintained by continuous GTP hydrolysis, biochemically regulated by dozens of kinases and associated proteins, connected to synaptic function through their role in vesicle trafficking and spine morphology. The microtubule was not a passive scaffold. It was an active, regulated, information processing structure, present in every neuron at massive density. The two collaborated and published Orchestrated Objective Reduction, ORC-OR, in 1996 in the journal Mathematics and Computers in Simulation. The orchestrated refers to the role of the neural environment in regulating the quantum computation. MAP2 proteins, stop proteins, microtubule-associated kinases, and synaptic inputs all influence the conformation of the tubulin lattice, shaping which quantum states develop in the microtubule and for how long. The objective reduction refers to Penrose's gravitationally driven collapse. The claim, when the orchestrated quantum superposition in the microtubule lattice reaches the gravitational threshold, objective reduction occurs. This collapse is the moment of conscious experience, not the correlate of the moment itself. Each OR event is one quantum of conscious experience, and the sequence of OR events at the gamma frequency is the flow of conscious experience through time. The predicted frequency of OR events, governed by the mass and displacement of the involved protein superpositions, falls near 40 Hz for microtubule superpositions at the nanometer scale of conformational change. This is the gamma oscillation frequency. The gamma rhythm is not merely a correlate of consciousness. On the ORC-OR account, it is its temporal structure, the electromagnetic shadow of the underlying sequence of gravitational wave function collapses occurring in the microtubule lattices of the brain. Measure the gamma rhythm, and you are measuring, indirectly, the clock rate of conscious experience. Part 5. Tegmark, Decoherence and the Quantum Biology Revolution. The initial reception of ORC-OR among physicists and neuroscientists was largely hostile. The decisive objection came from Max Tegmark at MIT, who published a calculation in Physical Review E in 2000, titled Importance of Quantum Decoherence in Brain Processes. Tegmark calculated the timescale on which quantum superpositions in microtubules would decohere, become classical, losing quantum properties, through interaction with the thermal environment of the brain. His result: decoherence would occur in approximately 100 femtoseconds, or 10 to the minus 13 seconds. The timescale of neural activity is milliseconds, or 10 to the minus 3 seconds. The ratio is 10 billion to 1. Quantum coherence in microtubules, Tegmark concluded, is destroyed 10 billion times faster than neural processing occurs. The brain is simply too warm and wet for quantum coherence to survive long enough to influence anything. Many physicists treated this calculation as definitive. Quantum consciousness, they concluded, was simply physically impossible. The warm and wet dismissal became the standard response. Hagen, Hameroff, and Tuszynski responded in Physical Review E in 2002, challenging three specific assumptions in Tegmark's calculation. First, Tegmark had assumed that the superposition involved large displacements, comparable to the separation between oxygen atoms in the water surrounding the microtubule. Hagen and colleagues argued that the relevant superpositions are subtle electronic rearrangements within the hydrophobic pocket, with much smaller effective separations, reducing the gravitational self-energy and therefore extending the collapse time. Second, Tegmark had assumed thermal equilibrium, but living microtubules are maintained far from equilibrium by the continuous hydrolysis of GTP, which powers the dynamic instability of microtubule assembly and disassembly. Non-equilibrium systems can maintain coherence longer than equilibrium systems at the same temperature. Third, Tegmark had used Coulomb scattering, electromagnetic interactions with surrounding charged particles, as the primary decoherence channel. Within the hydrophobic pocket, van der Waals interactions dominate, not Coulomb scattering, and van der Waals interactions have a very different decoherence profile. With these three corrections applied, Hagen and colleagues obtained decoherence times of 10 to 100 microseconds, 7 orders of magnitude longer than Tegmark's estimate. The gap between coherence time and neural timescale narrowed from 10 billion to 1 to roughly 1,000 to 1. Still a significant gap, but not the categorical impossibility that Tegmark's number implied. The more important development, however, was not this calculation, but a sequence of experimental discoveries in quantum biology that empirically overthrew the assumption that warm, wet biological systems are categorically hostile to quantum coherence. The assumption was not derived from first principles. It was a generalization from the behavior of simple molecules in solution. What experiments showed, beginning in 2007, is that evolution has found ways to exploit quantum effects in precisely the warm, wet environments that physicists assumed would prevent them. The first landmark was Graham Fleming's group at UC Berkeley, publishing results in Nature in 2007 showing oscillatory quantum coherence in the Fenner-Matthews-Olson light harvesting complex of green sulfur bacteria. This protein complex transfers excited state energy from chlorophyll antenna molecules to the reaction center where photosynthesis occurs, with efficiency that approaches 99% under some conditions. Fleming's group showed that this energy transfer occurs through quantum coherent wave-like motion across the protein complex. Quantum superposition of multiple energy transfer pathways simultaneously, rather than classical random hopping between molecules. And this quantum coherence persisted at physiological temperatures, in a wet protein, in a living cell. The result was stunning because it directly contradicted the assumption underlying the warm and wet dismissal. Subsequent work has extended and refined this picture. Gregory Engel at Chicago, Gregory Scholes at Princeton, and then Toronto, Rienk van Grondel at Amsterdam. Many groups have studied quantum coherence in photosynthetic complexes at physiological conditions, finding robust quantum effects that appear to contribute to energy transfer efficiency. The field has also grappled with questions about whether the coherence is genuinely functional, whether it does anything useful, or is merely an incidental consequence of electronic structure. The most recent evidence suggests it is functional. The quantum superposition genuinely allows the protein complex to sample multiple energy transfer pathways simultaneously, finding the most efficient route, in a way that classical energy transfer cannot achieve. Evolution discovered quantum computing for energy transport at least 2 billion years ago. Bird navigation provides a second line of evidence. Migratory birds navigate using Earth's magnetic field through a radical pair mechanism in the cryptochrome protein of the retina. When a photon strikes the flavin adenine dinucleotide cofactor, an electron transfer creates two molecules each with an unpaired electron. These two electrons are quantum mechanically entangled in their spin states. They share a joint quantum state, even though they are on separate molecules. Earth's magnetic field interacts with the electron spins through hyperfine coupling. The interaction between electron spin and nuclear spin creates a small energy difference that is magnetic field dependent. This energy difference influences the chemical fate of the radical pair, whether it undergoes singlet or triplet recombination, in a way that depends on the orientation of the magnetic field. The bird reads the chemical signal as directional information. Behavioral experiments from Roswitha Vilchko's group, Henrik Moritzen at Oldenburg, and many other groups have shown that the bird's magnetic compass is sensitive to radio frequency oscillations at the Larmor frequency, the frequency at which electron spins precess in Earth's magnetic field, which is exactly the signature of the radical pair mechanism and cannot be explained by any classical magnetic sensing mechanism. Quantum entanglement in a warm, wet, living biological protein is the only known explanation. Enzyme catalysis provides a third pillar. Many enzymes catalyze reactions involving the transfer of protons or hydride ions from one molecule to another. Classical transition state theory predicts that the rate of such reactions depends on the temperature according to the Arrhenius equation, because molecules must have enough thermal energy to surmount the activation energy barrier. But detailed measurements of proton and hydride transfer rates in enzymes, including alcohol, dehydrogenase, dihydrofolate reductase, and aromatic amine dehydrogenase, show deviations from Arrhenius behavior that are signatures of quantum tunneling, the quantum mechanical ability to pass through an energy barrier rather than over it. The proton does not need enough energy to surmount the barrier. It exploits its quantum wave nature to penetrate the barrier directly. This tunneling has been confirmed by multiple groups, is temperature independent in the way tunneling predicts, and appears essential to the extraordinary rate accelerations that enzymes achieve. Quantum mechanics is not a marginal curiosity in enzyme function. It is part of the core mechanism. The cumulative lesson from quantum biology is that evolution is an optimizer that exploits every physical mechanism available. When quantum effects confer a fitness advantage, more efficient energy transfer, more sensitive magnetic sensing, faster catalysis, organisms find ways to maintain quantum coherence long enough to be useful, even in warm, wet, noisy environments. The textbook assumption that quantum effects are irrelevant to biology because biology is too warm and wet was not derived from first principles. It was a prejudice. It has been empirically falsified in multiple biological contexts. The question of whether the brain's microtubules are another such context, whether evolution has found a way to exploit quantum effects in the neurons of the brain, just as it found quantum effects in photosynthesis and navigation, is now a genuine and experimentally addressable scientific question. The categorical dismissal, based on warm and wet, is no longer scientifically defensible. Part 6. The new experiments. The experimental landscape has shifted significantly over the past 5 years, and the shift has happened on multiple independent fronts. No single result is conclusive, but the accumulation of specific, targeted, experimental findings bearing on quantum consciousness theories has made the previous default of casual dismissal scientifically untenable. In 2023, a paper in ACS Central Science, led by Aritra Kalra at the University of Toronto, and co-authored by Stuart Hameroff, Roger Penrose, Gregory Scholes, Jack Tuzinski, and collaborators, documented quantum exciton energy migration along isolated microtubules at room temperature. An exciton is a bound excited state complex, an electron-hole pair bound by Coulomb attraction, that can propagate along a molecular lattice through quantum coherent motion, exploring multiple pathways simultaneously. Kalra and colleagues used ultrafast fluorescence spectroscopy to track energy migration along taxol stabilized microtubules, finding signatures of quantum coherent exciton transport rather than classical diffusive hopping. The energy travels farther and faster than classical transfer predicts, in a way that matches quantum exciton transport models. This is quantum biology in a directly neuroscience relevant substrate at physiological conditions, demonstrating quantum coherent dynamics of the kind postulated by OR. The critical pharmacological component, Kalra and colleagues added two common anesthetic agents, isoflurane and etomidate, to the microtubule solutions in doses equivalent to clinically relevant anesthetic concentrations. The quantum exciton transport was diminished in a dose-dependent way. Drugs that abolish consciousness in living animals also diminish quantum dynamics in isolated microtubules. This is precisely what OR predicts, and it is not predicted by classical models of either anesthetic action or microtubule function. The result is specific, quantitative, pharmacologically targeted, and mechanistically interpretable in terms of the OR framework. In 2024, a study in eNeuro led by Paul Wiest and Stuart Hameroff administered opotholone B, a microtubule stabilizing drug used clinically as a chemotherapy agent for taxane-resistant tumours, to rats before anesthetic induction with isoflurane. The logic: if microtubule quantum states are required for consciousness, then stabilizing the microtubule lattice should make those quantum states harder to disrupt, requiring more anesthetic to overcome them. The animals received opotholone B systemically before exposure to isoflurane, and the researchers measured the time to loss of the writing reflex, the standard behavioral endpoint for anesthetic induction in rodents. Opotholone B treated rats required significantly more time to lose the writing reflex than vehicle-treated controls, and the effect was dose-dependent. A drug that stabilizes microtubule structure delays the loss of consciousness under anesthesia. No classical theory of anesthetic mechanism predicted this result, because classical theories of anesthesia do not assign a role in consciousness to microtubule structural dynamics. The prediction came specifically from OR, the Kerskens-Pérez result from Trinity College Dublin, published in the Journal of Physics Communications in 2022, is the most provocative and the most contested. Christian Kerskens and David Lopez Perez developed an MRI pulse sequence designed to detect macroscopic quantum entanglement among proton spins in brain tissue. Their protocol used a technique adapted from quantum information experiments by allowing proton spins in different brain regions to interact through an unknown mediator for a controlled period. Then, applying an entanglement detection sequence, they sought signatures of genuine quantum entanglement rather than classical spin correlations. They found such signatures in waking subjects. The signals were absent during sleep. They correlated with short-term memory performance across subjects. The interpretation, macroscopic quantum entanglement among proton spins in the brain, is present during consciousness and absent during sleep, and its strength correlates with cognitive function. The counter-arguments are serious. Several physicists have proposed that classical electromagnetic effects of neural electrical activity could produce the observed correlations without quantum entanglement. The protocol, while sophisticated, has not been independently replicated. A result this consequential requires replication by groups without any stake in the outcome, using improved protocols with better controls for classical electromagnetic confounds. That replication has not yet occurred as of mid-2026. The result is significant enough to take seriously. It is published in a peer-reviewed journal by physicists with credentials, and preliminary enough to hold with appropriate uncertainty. Anirban Bandyopadhyay's work at the National Institute for Materials Science in Tsukuba, Japan, spans a decade of papers using scanning tunneling microscopy, atomic force microscopy, and electrophysiology to characterize microtubule electrical properties. His group has found a hierarchy of vibrational resonances in individual microtubules spanning from below 1 Hz to above 100 kHz, overlapping with essentially every known neural oscillation frequency, including theta, 4 to 8 Hz, alpha, 8 to 12 Hz, beta, 12 to 30 Hz, gamma, 30 to 100 Hz, and high gamma ripples above 100 Hz. In papers published between 2020 and 2024, Bandyopadhyay's group showed that these microtubule resonances propagate as electrical signals across neuronal networks, influencing membrane voltage at the circuit scale. The microtubule appears to function as a nanoscale antenna that resonates at brain oscillation frequencies and couples to the electromagnetic field of the neural network, a picture consistent with the Orc-OR hypothesis that microtubule quantum dynamics are coordinated at the network scale by gamma and theta oscillations. Part 7. The dreaming brain as quantum laboratory. Among the many states of the conscious brain, REM sleep presents a distinctive and scientifically interesting context for quantum consciousness theories. This is because REM removes, selectively and systematically, the external classical constraints that ordinarily keep the brain's quantum dynamics anchored to definite world-tracking states. To understand why this matters, it helps to think about the role of external sensory input in quantum terms. In waking, the sensory systems continuously provide data about the external world. This data is classical. The photons arriving at the retina are definite photons, emitted from definite surfaces, travelling in definite directions. The neural processing of this classical input involves repeated effective measurements at each stage: transduction, relay, cortical processing. And each effective measurement pushes the relevant neural quantum states toward the definite classical state that matches the external stimulus. A red apple at arm's length provides continuous evidence that the apple is there, that it is red, that it is a certain distance away. The ongoing sensory input keeps the perceptual system's quantum states collapsed toward the states that accurately represent the external world. The external world acts as a source of continuous classical information that constrains which quantum states the perceptual system occupies. REM sleep removes this constraint systematically. The thalamic reticular nucleus closes the thalamic gating of primary sensory information. Relay neurons in the thalamus reduce their transmission of signals from the sensory periphery. The brainstem muscle atonia eliminates proprioceptive and tactile feedback from the body's motor activity. The brain is now operating in a genuinely closed loop, processing only its own internally generated signals, with no classical external data forcing its quantum states toward definite external reality tracking values. The quantum states of the perceptual and representational systems are free to evolve according to their own internal dynamics before collapsing into definite experienced content. The aminergic neurochemistry of REM makes this more specific. Serotonergic neurons in the dorsal ray fire tonically during waking at 1 to 5 spikes per second, and their axons project widely through the cortex, modulating thousands of synapses. Noradrenergic neurons in the locus coeruleus fire similarly widely. Both populations essentially stop firing during REM sleep. Their activity falls to near zero. This aminergic withdrawal is one of the most dramatic and consistent neurochemical events in the sleep-wake cycle, and it correlates precisely with the onset and offset of REM. Serotonin and norepinephrine both influence microtubule dynamics through kinase pathways. Serotonin activates protein kinase C and casein kinase 2, which phosphorylate microtubule-associated proteins. Norepinephrine activates protein kinase A through beta-adrenergic receptors, with phosphorylation targets including tau and MAP2, both of which regulate microtubule stability. The aminergic withdrawal during REM therefore removes ongoing biochemical influences on microtubule conformation that were continuously active during waking. Simultaneously, cholinergic tone rises during REM to its highest levels of the 24-hour cycle. Acetylcholine released from a pedunculopontine and later a dorsal tegmental nuclei drives the hippocampal theta rhythm and activates muscarinic receptors broadly across the cortex. Muscarinic receptor activation affects microtubule dynamics through its own kinase pathways, specifically through activation of phospholipase C, diacylglycerol, and protein kinase C, putting the microtubule network in a different conformational regime than either waking or non-REM sleep. The biochemical context of the dreaming brain is not merely reduced activity, it is a specific, reproducible, evolutionarily conserved pattern of neuromodulation that puts every neuron's microtubule lattice in a distinctive state. On an OR account, this matters directly. The orchestration of microtubule quantum superpositions, their build-up, their timing, the selection of which quantum states develop, is regulated by the biochemical environment. A different biochemical environment produces different orchestration, different quantum dynamics, and therefore different conscious experience. The REM state, with its specific pattern of neuromodulation, maximum cholinergic, zero aminergic, may produce microtubule orchestration that allows quantum superpositions to develop and persist over a wider range of states before collapsing. The absence of aminergic constraint removes one source of environmental decoherence. The cholinergic drive puts the microtubule lattice in a conformational regime that may sustain coherence longer. The result is quantum superpositions that explore a broader state space before OR collapse, which means conscious experience that represents possibilities rather than actualities. This is dreaming, experience of a world not constrained by external classical data, because the quantum dynamics generating the experience are not constrained by external classical data. The strangeness of dreams is the signature of quantum states, uncoupled from external reality. The phenomenon of hypnagogia, the transitional state between waking and sleep, illuminates the boundary. As serotonin and norepinephrine levels fall and the thalamic gates begin to close, but before REM is fully established, the brain enters a partial quantum opening. External sensory input can still break through, but the internal quantum dynamics are no longer fully constrained. The imagery that appears in hypnagogia, transforming, geometrically complex, associatively rich, often accompanied by a sense of portentous meaning, reflects this intermediate state. The quantum dynamics are loosening from external classical constraint without yet entering the full unconstrained REM regime. Artists and scientists who have cultivated the hypnagogic state, Edison with his steel balls, Dali with his key, Kekulé dreaming of the benzene ring, are deliberately harvesting the creative product of a brain in partial quantum transition. Part 8. Integrated information theory. Integrated information theory developed from a completely different starting point than OR, and the fact that the two theories are increasingly seen as potentially convergent is one of the more interesting features of the current theoretical landscape. Giulio Tononi at the University of Wisconsin-Madison published the first version of IIT in 2004 in BMC Neuroscience, building on ideas about the mathematical structure of conscious experience. The theory has been refined through several versions: IIT 3.0 in 2014, IIT 4.0 in 2023, with collaborators including Melanie Bowley, Larissa Albantakis, and Christoph Koch, who came to IIT from his long collaboration with Francis Crick. IIT begins from phenomenology rather than neuroscience. Tononi asks, what are the essential structural features of conscious experience from which we can derive what kind of physical system could have those features? He identifies 5 axioms. Intrinsicality. Experience exists from the inside, for itself, not for any external observer. Information. Each experience is specific. This particular shade of blue at this location. Not merely blue in general, not merely visual experience in general. Integration. Experience is unified, not decomposable into independent parts that can be experienced separately. Exclusion. The experience is definite rather than a superposition of multiple possible experiences. Composition. The experience has internal structure. Parts of it can be distinguished even within the unity. From these axioms, Tononi derives requirements for any physical substrate of consciousness. The substrate must have intrinsic causal power. It must generate information about itself from within without requiring an external observer. It must be integrated. The whole must generate more information than the sum of its parts acting independently. This integration is quantified by phi, integrated information, defined as the reduction in uncertainty about a system's causal states that comes from taking it as a whole rather than as a set of independent subsystems. High phi means the whole is causally irreducible. No partition of the system captures its full causal structure. Low phi means the system can be understood as a collection of independent parts. The claim, phi measures consciousness. A system's phi equals its degree of consciousness. IIT predicts the sleep-wake cycle with striking precision. During slow-wave sleep, N3, the deepest stage, large populations of neurons fire synchronously in the slow oscillation, a coordinated up-down cycle in which essentially the entire cortex fires together, then falls silent together, approximately once per second. This extraordinary synchrony collapses phi. When all elements of a system do the same thing at the same time, the behavior of the whole is fully predicted by the behavior of any single part. An integrated information approach is zero. The system is maximally decomposable. IIT predicts near-zero consciousness during slow-wave sleep, consistent with the near-total absence of subjective experience on awakening from N3. During REM sleep, the cortex is highly desynchronized. Different regions fire in different patterns, different frequencies, with complex and evolving relationships among them. The causal structure is rich, differentiated, and highly integrated. IIT predicts phi close to waking values and correspondingly rich conscious experience, consistent with the vivid, complex phenomenology of dreaming. The Perturbational Complexity Index, developed by Marcello Massimini's group at the University of Milan, operationalizes this prediction. A TMS pulse is delivered to the cortex, and the resulting EEG response is measured. In waking, a TMS pulse to frontal cortex propagates as a complex differentiated wave across the entire brain, different regions responding at different times with different patterns, before dissipating. The complexity and differentiation of this response is the Perturbational Complexity Index. During slow-wave sleep, the same TMS pulse produces a large local response that does not propagate. The stimulated region fires, and the wave dies out without spreading. During REM, the response looks more like waking. Under anesthesia, the response again becomes local and simple. The Perturbational Complexity Index tracks consciousness across states with a sensitivity that no single EEG measure achieved before it, and it validates IIT's core prediction. Consciousness is quantifiable as the integrated information of the brain, and the transition from consciousness to unconsciousness is a transition from high to low phi. The convergence with or. IIT is formulated classically, but the physical substrate that achieves high phi may be quantum. Classical entanglement, correlations between subsystems due to shared information, is weaker than quantum entanglement. Quantum entanglement produces correlations that cannot be derived from any local classical model, and these correlations produce a form of integration stronger than anything achievable by classical mechanisms. If the neurons of the brain are quantum entangled through microtubule quantum dynamics, as OR proposes, then their actual phi may exceed what any classical causal model can compute. The quantum entanglement is the mechanism by which the brain achieves the high integrated information that IIT identifies as consciousness. Tononi's theory identifies what consciousness is, integrated information, and OR identifies the mechanism by which the brain achieves it, quantum entanglement in microtubules, organized through objective reduction events at gamma frequencies. They are not competing theories. They may be descriptions at different levels of the same physical process. Part 9. Lucid dreaming and the quantum observer. Lucid dreaming occupies a special position in the phenomenology of consciousness because it is a naturally occurring state that combines properties of both dreaming and waking. The dreamer is conscious within the dream, aware that they are dreaming, and often capable of directing the dream's content and narrative. The EEG signature of lucid dreaming is well established, the theta-dominant, desynchronized REM pattern, with elevated frontal gamma activity at approximately 40 Hz superimposed. Both the resting REM state and the additional gamma in frontal regions are present. The gamma is what distinguishes lucid from non-lucid dreaming. The causal evidence came from Ursula Voss and colleagues' 2014 study in Nature Neuroscience, applying transcranial alternating current stimulation at 40 Hz to the frontal scalp during confirmed REM sleep, reliably induced lucid dreaming. When the experimenters applied the stimulation, subjects who had not previously been lucid in that sleep session began reporting lucid dreams, and the EEG showed the frontal gamma enhancement characteristic of lucid dreaming. The same effect was not produced by stimulation at other frequencies. The 40 Hz gamma frequency specifically, applied frontally, was sufficient to produce the metacognitive self-awareness of lucid dreaming. This is one of the clearest causal demonstrations in consciousness neuroscience, a specific physical intervention producing a specific conscious state change, mediated by a specific neural oscillation frequency. The OR interpretation. The frontal gamma represents frontal cortex microtubule networks crossing a quantum coherence threshold. In ordinary non-lucid dreaming, frontal microtubules are active. They contribute to the REM dream state, but not organized into the specific pattern of coherent quantum computation that generates self-referential awareness. The dream is experienced but not observed within by a metacognitive self. When gamma oscillations at 40 Hz organize the frontal microtubule networks, aligning the timing of their quantum dynamics, synchronizing their objective reduction events, the resulting collapse is qualitatively different. Not just experience, but self-aware experience. The experience of knowing that one is experiencing the same physical mechanism that generates ordinary experience at a higher level of quantum coherence in the frontal metacognitive systems generates the awareness of experiencing. This interpretation is consistent with the broader pharmacology of lucid dreaming. Galantamine, an acetylcholinesterase inhibitor that elevates endogenous acetylcholine by preventing its breakdown, substantially increases both REM sleep duration and the incidence of lucid dreaming. The cholinergic mechanism is established. Galantamine's effect on lucid dreaming runs through its cholinergic action, not through any other pharmacological property. But acetylcholine also affects microtubule dynamics, and the specific conformational regime of the microtubule lattice under high cholinergic tone may be more conducive to the organized quantum coherence that OR associates with high-phase conscious experience. Henry Stapp, a theoretical physicist at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, who trained under Werner Heisenberg and has spent decades developing the implications of the von Neumann-Wigner interpretation of quantum mechanics, has proposed that conscious attention acts as a quantum Zeno measurement, stabilizing neural quantum states through repeated internal observation. The quantum Zeno effect, named after the pre-Socratic philosopher, is a real quantum mechanical phenomenon documented in isolated quantum systems. A system that is repeatedly measured is inhibited from evolving away from its current state, because each measurement collapses it back. The act of observation literally slows the quantum dynamics. Stapp's proposal extends this to consciousness. The brain's conscious attention constitutes a series of rapid, internal quantum measurements on its own quantum states, and the contents of attention are stabilized by the frequency of this internal observation. Lucid dreaming demonstrates this with phenomenological clarity. The novice lucid dreamer who first becomes aware within a dream faces an immediate practical challenge. The dream destabilizes. Awareness of the dream tends to trigger awakening. Experienced lucid dreamers learn to stabilize the dream by actively directing their attention, touching the dream environment, spinning in place, looking at the ground, techniques that focus deliberate conscious observation on the dream content and stabilize it. On a quantum Zeno account, these stabilization techniques work by increasing the rate of internal quantum observations on the dream state, Zeno stabilizing the quantum superposition against decoherence. The phenomenological experience of sustaining a lucid dream through deliberate attention matches the quantum Zeno mechanism with surprising fidelity. The meditators report that sustained, clear attention produces a qualitatively different and more stable quality of conscious experience, may be the same phenomenon in a waking context. Part 10. The Anesthesia Mystery. There is a clinical puzzle that has sat at the center of anesthesiology for over 150 years, comfortably unexplained, largely unacknowledged in textbooks, and of potentially enormous significance for quantum consciousness theories. William Morton demonstrated the use of ether for surgical anesthesia at Massachusetts General Hospital on October 16, 1846. The surgeons could make incisions, manipulate tissue, and complete procedures without the patient responding to pain. The technique spread with extraordinary speed. Within a year, ether anesthesia was in use in Europe, and within 2 years, chloroform had been introduced as an alternative. For the first time in human history, major surgery did not require the patient to be restrained and screaming. The development was among the most significant in the history of medicine. What anesthesiologists have never been able to explain is precisely how anesthetic drugs produce unconsciousness at the molecular level. The standard pharmacological account that anesthetics potentiate GABA A receptors reducing neural excitability across the brain, and thereby produce unconsciousness, is a description of one pharmacological action of one class of agents. It does not constitute a mechanistic account of consciousness. Reducing neural excitability is not an explanation for why the loss of consciousness follows, any more than saying the car stopped running because the ignition failed explains the internal combustion cycle. And more troublingly, it does not account for the Meyer-Overturn correlation, which shows that anesthetic potency is predicted by lipid solubility across an enormous range of compounds, most of which have nothing to do with GABA-A receptors. The full strangeness of the Meyer-Overturn correlation emerges when you examine its outliers and its scope. The correlation holds across inert gases, volatile hydrocarbons, halogenated ethers, noble gases including xenon, chloroform, diethyl ether, propofol, ketamine. Compounds with almost nothing structurally in common, spanning 5 orders of magnitude in molecular weight, produced across more than 150 years of chemical development. Every time a new anesthetic agent has been developed, its potency has fallen on the same correlation line. And the correlation itself, the fact that lipid solubility predicts anesthetic potency with extraordinary accuracy, implies that the mechanism of anesthetic action involves dissolving in something lipophilic in the brain. Not a specific receptor, not a specific ion channel, something non-specifically lipophilic. Xenon makes the puzzle acute. Xenon is a noble gas. It has a completely filled outer electron shell, making it essentially chemically inert. It cannot form the hydrogen bonds and ionic interactions that characterize receptor binding. It cannot act on GABA-A receptors through any conventional pharmacological mechanism. Its known molecular interactions with proteins are limited to weak van der Waals forces and dispersive interactions, the kind that operate in hydrophobic pockets where electrons from the noble gas polarize transiently in response to the fluctuating electron cloud of the surrounding protein. Xenon has a weak NMDA receptor antagonism and modest effects on TREC1 potassium channels, but neither of these quantitatively accounts for xenon's anesthetic potency at the concentrations where it produces unconsciousness. Yet xenon at approximately 63% atmospheric pressure reliably produces surgical anesthesia in humans, and its potency is predicted precisely by the Meyer-Overturn correlation. Whatever xenon is doing to abolish consciousness, it is doing it through non-specific lipophilic dissolution in a protein pocket, because that is the only interaction available to it. The hydrophobic pockets of tubulin dimers are among the most extensively characterized non-specific lipophilic binding sites in neurons. They are large enough, sufficiently hydrophobic, and distributed throughout the neuronal cytoskeleton at very high density. And they are precisely the sites where, on the Orchestrated account, quantum electronic dynamics critical to consciousness are occurring. Xenon dissolving in the tubulin hydrophobic pocket, changing the dielectric environment, shifting the electron density, altering the quantum tunneling properties of the mobile electron, would disrupt the quantum dynamics of that pocket in a way that accounts for anesthetic action without requiring any specific receptor. The Meyer-Overturn correlation then becomes a prediction, not a mystery. The lipophilic pockets are the sites of quantum consciousness, and any molecule lipophilic enough to partition into them will disrupt the quantum dynamics and suppress consciousness in proportion to its concentration in those pockets. Potency equals partition coefficient. The 2,000-year-old mystery of the Meyer-Overturn correlation dissolves if microtubule quantum dynamics are the molecular substrate of consciousness. Part 11. The binding problem and dream architecture. When you see a red ball rolling across a floor, you see an object, red, round, moving, in a specific location, with a specific sound, carrying whatever emotional valence the situation assigns. The redness, roundness, motion, position, sound, and meaning are unified in a single coherent perceptual object. This seems obvious, unremarkable. It is in fact one of the deepest unsolved problems in neuroscience. Colour is processed in area V4 of the visual cortex, motion in area V5, also called MT, in the dorsal stream, shape in V2, and the lateral occipital complex, identity and categorical membership in the temporal ventral stream, including the fusiform gyrus and the anterior temporal cortex, location in the parietal dorsal stream, the emotional significance in the amygdala, the name and linguistic category in the left inferior frontal gyrus. These processing streams are anatomically distinct, functionally specialized, separated by up to many centimeters of cortex, and temporally asynchronous. Different attributes reach their peak processing representation at slightly different times after the stimulus. The neural correlates of redness are spatially and temporally separate from the neural correlates of roundness, which are separate from the neural correlates of motion, yet the experience is unified. How? Francis Crick and Christoph Koch proposed in 1990 in their landmark paper in Seminars in the Neurosciences that the binding is achieved through synchronized gamma oscillation. Neural populations processing different attributes of the same object oscillate at the same gamma frequency and in phase, while populations processing attributes of different objects oscillate out of phase or at different frequencies. The binding is temporal, features bound in experience are bound in time, co-oscillating in the same 40 Hz cycle. This gamma binding hypothesis has received substantial experimental support and also substantial counter-evidence. Binding without synchrony occurs and synchrony without binding. The hypothesis is contested and the mechanisms of binding remain genuinely unclear. The global workspace theory, developed by Bernard Bars in 1988 and given neural implementation by Stanislas Dehaene and Jean-Pierre Changeux, proposes a different solution. Binding occurs through the broadcast of information into a global workspace involving long-range connections among frontal, parietal, and temporal regions. Binding is a matter of access to a shared workspace rather than temporal synchronization. This proposal handles some of the binding data better than the gamma hypothesis and has the advantage of also accounting for the selective nature of attention. But it faces the question of how the workspace itself achieves the unity of its contents. What binds the information in the workspace into a unified experience rather than a collection of separately available items? Quantum entanglement offers a fundamentally different approach that dissolves the problem rather than solving it. If the neural populations processing different features of a scene are quantum mechanically entangled, their quantum states are correlated in a way that cannot be decomposed into separable states for each population. Then their information is not merely synchronized or co-accessed, but jointly instantiated. The combined quantum state of the distributed neural populations is the experience. The binding is not achieved by a mechanism coordinating separate processes. It is constitutive of the physics of the situation. Entangled quantum systems share a single quantum state, and that state has properties that neither system has separately. The unity of conscious experience is the unity of the entangled quantum state, not a product of coordination after the fact, but the nature of the physical system. For dreaming, this matters in a specific way. The binding of dream imagery has properties different from waking perceptual binding. Dream characters are frequently multiple people simultaneously. The dream figure, who is recognizably your partner, is also your childhood friend and somehow also your supervisor, all at once, without confusion or incoherence within the dream. Dream locations are multiply realized. The room you are in is your childhood home, and also your current home, and also a place you have never seen, all simultaneously. This simultaneous multiple identity, which Freud called condensation and treated as one of the primary mechanisms of dream work, is not a failure of binding. It is a different kind of binding, one that accommodates multiple semantic associations simultaneously in a single perceptual object. On a quantum entanglement account, this is exactly what would happen when binding occurs through quantum entanglement, unconstrained by external classical data. In waking, sensory input anchors the entanglement. The quantum state of the perceptual system is constrained by classical information from the external world, and the entanglement among neural populations represents the specific features of the specific external object being perceived. The quantum state is highly constrained. In dreaming without external sensory anchoring, the entanglement is free to develop across a wider range of memory associations, emotional valences, and semantic clusters. The dream figure is bound together from multiple memory traces through quantum entanglement that spans more associations than external sensory constraint would permit in waking. The bizarreness of dreams. Fowlux's dream bizarreness scale measurably increases through the night as REM periods lengthen and deepen. is a quantitative signature of unconstrained quantum binding. The physics predicts the phenomenology. Part 12. Time, Consciousness, and Objective Reduction. The experience of time is one of the most intimate and most puzzling features of consciousness. You are not experiencing a series of static snapshots connected by memory. You are experiencing a flow. The immediate past seems present, the immediate future seems imminent, and the moment itself seems to have temporal depth, to be extended across a brief interval rather than existing at a geometrical instant. William James called this the specious present in his 1890 Principles of Psychology and estimated its duration at roughly 2 to 3 seconds, the interval over which experience feels like a single unified now, rather than a sequence of separate moments. Classical neuroscience accounts for the specious present through working memory and predictive coding. Working memory maintains recent information active for several seconds, allowing the immediate past to remain phenomenologically present. Predictive coding generates anticipations of what is about to happen, which are updated against incoming data continuously, allowing the immediate future to influence the present moment. The integration of recent memory, current input, and immediate prediction over a window of 2 to 3 seconds produces the experience of a temporally extended now. This is a plausible account of the temporal processing. It does not explain why the processing has the character of flow, why the past feels like it has just happened rather than simply being the most recent entry in a stored record, or why there is a sense of time passing rather than merely time having passed. Stuart Hameroff's proposal, developed in papers published in Physics of Life Reviews in 2013 and in Timing and Time Perception in 2024, is that subjective time is constituted by the sequence of objective reduction events in the microtubule networks of the brain. Each OR event is not a moment happening within a pre-existing background time. It is a moment that constitutes time locally for the conscious system undergoing the reduction. The sequence of OR events is the subjective flow of time, not time within which experience occurs, but the physical events that are time from the inside. There is no more fundamental time in which OR events are embedded. OR events are what time is for the experiencing subject. Carlo Rovelli's work on the foundations of temporal physics arrives at a related conclusion from a different direction. In his development of loop quantum gravity and relational quantum mechanics, and in his 2021 book, The Order of Time, Rovelli argues that time is not a fundamental feature of physical reality, but emerges from the structure of quantum events. There is no universal time flowing everywhere at the same rate. The time coordinate of general relativity is not time in the subjective sense, but a parameter labeling different space-time slices. Local time, the time experienced at a specific location, is constituted by the local sequence of quantum events and the entropy gradient that makes later states distinguishable from earlier ones. The subjective flow of time is the local experience of this physical sequence, viewed from inside. If Hameroff and Rovelli are both right, if subjective time is constituted by quantum events in the brain, and physical time is constituted by quantum events in general, then subjective time and physical time are not two separate things. They are the same thing, viewed from different perspectives. The inside view is subjective time, the felt flow of experience, the sense of the present moment, the qualitative character of time passing. The outside view is physical time, quantum events in space-time, describable by wave functions and their evolution according to the Schrödinger equation. The hard problem of time, why does time feel like it flows rather than simply being a sequence of states, dissolves in the same move as the hard problem of consciousness. They are not additional facts about the physical processes, but the same facts viewed from the inside. Dreams make the relationship between physical and subjective time experimentally accessible in a unique way. Dream time is famously unlike waking time. Narratives spanning apparent years occur in 15 minutes of REM. Single moments expand into elaborate sequences. Past and future interpenetrate without sharp distinction. If subjective time is constituted by the sequence of OR events in hippocampal cortical circuits, and if the hippocampus during REM replay runs its theta oscillation at a faster rate than the external clock, replaying a day's experience in an hour of sleep, then the rate of OR events in the hippocampal cortical loop during REM is genuinely faster than during waking. The dreamer who experiences a year in 15 minutes is not confabulating or misremembering. The clock of their subjective time constituted by OR events paced by the hippocampal theta replay, is genuinely running faster than external clock time during that REM episode. The physics of the dreaming brain determines the phenomenology of dream time. Part 13. What an artificial mind would require. The question of artificial consciousness, whether machines can be conscious and what kind of machine could be, is not merely speculative. It has immediate practical stakes in 2026. Medical systems use AI to monitor patients for signs of pain and distress. Legal systems are beginning to consider whether AI systems have interests that matter morally. The development of increasingly sophisticated AI agents raises the question of whether they experience anything, and if so, whether that matters for how they are treated. The dominant framework for answering this question in AI research is behavioral. If a system behaves as if it is conscious, if it reports experiences, responds to pain signals, demonstrates preferences, produces contextually appropriate descriptions of inner states, then it is, at least functionally, conscious. The Turing test, proposed by Alan Turing in 1950 in mind, asks whether a machine's behavior is indistinguishable from a human's in conversation. If a machine passes this test, Turing suggested, there is no principled reason to deny it thought. If consciousness requires specific physical processes, quantum objective reductions in microtubule lattices, or any specific substrate-dependent process, then the behavioral criterion is simply wrong. A system that behaves as if it is conscious, but lacks the relevant physical substrate, does not have the relevant physical substrate. The behavior is produced by processes that do not include consciousness. The behavioral indistinguishability from a conscious system is irrelevant, because behavior is not consciousness. This is not a new point. John Searle made a version of it in 1980 in his Chinese room argument published in Behavioral and Brain Sciences. Searle imagined himself inside a room, receiving Chinese symbols, consulting a rulebook to produce Chinese output symbols, and thereby passing as a Chinese speaker, without understanding a word of Chinese. The room produces the behavior of Chinese understanding without any understanding being present. Searle's conclusion, syntax, formal manipulation of symbols, is not sufficient for semantics, for genuine understanding. The Chinese room has been argued about for 40 years, and its implications remain contested, but the underlying intuition that behavioral performance is not the same as the real thing resonates with the quantum consciousness point. A classical computer perfectly simulating quantum objective reductions is not performing quantum objective reductions. The simulation is not the process. Large language models, the systems responsible for the most impressive AI language performance of the past several years, are, in every fundamental detail, classical computational processes. They compute matrix products and apply nonlinear functions over very large matrices, using fixed-point arithmetic in classical silicon at temperatures near room temperature. There are no quantum components. The computations are fully deterministic, given the starting state, except for random number generation used in sampling. Whatever is happening, when a large language model produces a contextually appropriate, informative, fluent response, and it is impressive whatever it is happening through classical computation. On an OR account, these systems cannot be conscious, regardless of behavioral performance. The relevant physics is simply absent. On an IIT account, the PHI of these systems is likely very low. Their causal architecture does not produce the kind of irreducible integration that IIT identifies with consciousness. Most current deep learning architectures are largely feed-forward. Information flows from input to output through layers with limited recurrent feedback. And feed-forward architectures are phi near zero because each layer's state is fully determined by the previous layer's state, and there is no irreducible integrated causal structure. Attention mechanisms create within-layer correlations that increase phi somewhat, but likely not to the levels associated with rich conscious experience in IIT's framework. The path to artificial consciousness, if there is one, may require quantum computation in substrates organized analogously to biological microtubule networks, a quantum computer that physically implements quantum superposition, entanglement, and wave function. Collapse events in materials with appropriate properties might, on the OR account, support some form of consciousness, not because it is biological, but because it is quantum. Current quantum computers operate on superconducting qubits at temperatures near absolute zero, in refrigerated chambers, under conditions very different from the warm, regulated, chemically rich environment of living neurons. Whether the relevant quantum dynamics for consciousness can be achieved in such systems is unknown. It may be the most important question in consciousness science for the next century, and it is not currently being seriously investigated. Part 14. The Honest Reckoning. Intellectual honesty requires that I be precise about what the evidence establishes, what it suggests, and what it does not support. These are not the same category, and conflating them is a failure of rigor that serves no one. What is established? The hard problem of consciousness is real and remains unsolved within classical neuroscience. No classical theory has derived the qualitative character of experience from a description of neural activity. This is not a temporary gap that more neuroscience will eventually close. It is a conceptual gap that has been recognized and formalized by the most careful philosophers of mind, and has resisted resolution for as long as it has been clearly stated. Quantum biology has empirically established that evolution can exploit quantum effects, coherence, entanglement, tunneling, in warm-wet, biological systems at physiological temperatures. The categorical dismissal of quantum consciousness based on the warm and wet argument has been falsified in multiple independent biological contexts. These two facts together justify taking quantum consciousness theories seriously as scientific proposals rather than as fringe speculation. What the recent experiments suggest, quantum effects occur in microtubules, the specific structures proposed by OR. These effects are sensitive to anesthetic agents at clinically relevant doses. Stabilizing microtubule structure delays anesthetic induction of unconsciousness in living animals. Signals potentially consistent with macroscopic quantum entanglement have been detected in waking human brains and correlate with conscious state. These are specific, targeted experimental findings consistent with OR predictions. They are also preliminary, requiring replication, and in most cases, admit of alternative classical explanations that cannot be fully excluded. What the evidence does not establish, that quantum processes in microtubules are the mechanism of consciousness, that Penrose's gravitational objective reduction is the correct theory of wave function collapse, that IIT correctly identifies phi as the measure of consciousness, that any specific quantum consciousness theory is correct. The evidence is suggestive and moving in a consistent direction, but it is far from the kind of replication, mechanistic characterization, and theoretical integration that would constitute scientific consensus. The Gran Sasso argument is worth addressing directly. OR's gravitational collapse model makes predictions about spontaneous radiation, photons emitted during wave function collapse events, that should in principle be detectable. Experiments in the Gran Sasso underground laboratory in Italy, shielded from cosmic rays, have placed upper bounds on the rate of such spontaneous radiation events that constrain some versions of objective reduction theories. Penrose and Hameroff have argued these constraints apply only to the simplest, spatially unconstrained versions of OR, and do not exclude the biologically embedded version, in which OR events are embedded in the biochemical environment of microtubule lattices. The argument is technical, and the debate continues. The constraint is real and should not be ignored in assessing the theory. The replication crisis in science, the discovery that many published findings in psychology, medicine, and neuroscience do not replicate when independent laboratories attempt to repeat them, should calibrate our confidence in individual studies, especially studies with unconventional protocols, novel methodologies, and results that would be surprising from the perspective of mainstream theory. The Kerskens-Pérez MRI result is exactly this kind of study. It is published in a peer-reviewed journal by credentialed physicists. It may also be a false positive, an artifact of an unconventional protocol, or a result that reflects a subtle classical electromagnetic confound rather than genuine quantum entanglement. Until it is replicated with improved protocols by independent groups, the appropriate epistemic attitude is attentive uncertainty rather than either confident acceptance or dismissal. The honest summary: we do not know what consciousness is, and we do not know what dreaming is at the level of physical mechanism. The classical neuroscience framework has produced extraordinary knowledge about the neural correlates of consciousness and the neurophysiology of sleep, but has not closed the explanatory gap between physical description and qualitative experience. quantum consciousness theories offer a framework that takes the hard problem seriously, generates specific experimental predictions, is consistent with the relevant biology and physics, and is increasingly supported by suggestive preliminary evidence. They are serious scientific proposals in a domain where no proposal has yet achieved confirmation. That is exactly where the science is. Part 15. The next decade. The tools available to consciousness science are advancing in ways that will make the central questions empirically addressable in ways they were not 5 years ago. Nitrogen vacancy center quantum sensing, NV center diamond sensors, can detect the magnetic field of a single electron, spin at nanometer resolution, operating at room temperature in biological environments. The technology has been advancing rapidly, driven by interest in quantum computing and precision measurement. Applied to single microtubules in living neurons, NV center sensors could directly measure the lifetime of quantum superpositions, a direct measurement of coherence time, or Wiest entanglement, without the approximations of theoretical calculations. If microtubule quantum superpositions persist for microseconds in living neurons, NV center sensors with current or near-future sensitivity can detect it. If they decohere in femtoseconds as Tegmark's original calculation suggested, the measurement will show that too. This is the measurement that would either validate or falsify the central empirical claim of Orchestrated, and it is technically feasible within the current decade. Ultrafast spectroscopy is advancing in parallel. Two-dimensional electronic spectroscopy, the technique used by Fleming's group to detect quantum coherence in the FMO complex, has been refined over the 17 years since that discovery to work with increasing sensitivity and time resolution on biological samples. Applied to microtubule preparations with and without anesthetic agents, and with and without microtubule stabilizing drugs, this technique could characterize the quantum dynamics of microtubule electron systems in detail, sufficient to test specific OR predictions about how orchestration by the biological environment influences coherence. The pharmacological experiments are available now with current tools. If Orchestrated is correct, then drugs that stabilize microtubules should increase the intensity and incidence of lucid dreaming, because the same mechanism that delays anesthetic induction of unconsciousness should delay the spontaneous fluctuations that end lucid dream states. Galantamine's mechanism of lucid dream enhancement might be partly mediated through its cholinergic effects on microtubule dynamics, separate from its direct action on sleep architecture. These hypotheses generate concrete predictions, testable in human volunteers, with standard polysomnography equipment, structured dream reporting, and carefully titrated drug administration. The experiments are not technically demanding. They have not been done. Large-scale quantum brain mapping, extending the Kerskens-Pérez approach with higher field MRI, improved pulse sequences, with better classical confound controls, and independent replication groups could determine whether macroscopic quantum entanglement in the brain is a real phenomenon, what its spatial distribution is, how it correlates with different states of consciousness, and whether it changes with anesthetic administration in the way that Orchestrated predicts. The technical barriers are real but not prohibitive. The experiment requires a small team of physicists and neuroscientists with the right combination of skills, good equipment, and sufficient funding to complete a rigorous multi-site replication. Computational quantum biology is advancing rapidly. Molecular dynamics simulations of tubulin dimers that include quantum mechanical treatment of the hydrophobic pocket electron using density functional theory or quantum Monte Carlo methods can characterize the quantum energy landscape of the pocket, the effect of anesthetic molecules on the electron's quantum state, and the decoherence dynamics in realistic models of the biological environment. These calculations are computationally demanding, but increasingly tractable on modern high-performance computing systems. They can provide theoretical guidance about where to look experimentally and what to measure. The decade ahead may be the one in which quantum consciousness shifts from a speculative possibility to a question with a definite experimental answer. That shift would be among the most significant events in the history of science, not because the answer is predetermined, but because the question, when answered, will touch every domain where consciousness matters: medicine, ethics, law, artificial intelligence, our understanding of what we are and what we share with other conscious beings. The question is not academic, it is practical in the deepest sense. Part 16. Panpsychism and the combination problem. IIT implies something that most scientifically trained people initially find deeply uncomfortable, that any system with phi greater than 0 has some degree of consciousness. A thermostat, if it has any integrated information at all, has some infinitesimal degree of experience. This implication is not an accident of the theory, it follows directly from its axioms. If consciousness is identical to integrated information, and if even simple physical systems integrate some information, then consciousness extends down to the simplest physical systems. This view has a name that dates back centuries: panpsychism, the claim that experience is fundamental and widespread in nature, not an emergent property of complex biological brains, but a feature of matter itself. Panpsychism has a long philosophical history. In antiquity, Thales held that the world is full of gods, by which he meant most interpreters think that nature is animated throughout. Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, in the 17th century, proposed that the fundamental constituents of reality are monads, simple substances each of which has a kind of perception. Baruch Spinoza held that mind and matter are two attributes of a single underlying substance. In the 20th century, Alfred North Whitehead developed what he called the philosophy of organism, in which experience is a feature of every actual occasion, every quantum of process in the universe. These traditions were largely set aside by the success of the mechanistic physical sciences, which seemed to leave no room for experience at the fundamental level. The hard problem has brought panpsychism back into serious philosophical discussion. Philip Goff at Durham University has become its most prominent contemporary defender. In his 2019 book, Galileo's Error, Goff argues that the scientific revolution's foundational methodological choice to describe nature mathematically in terms of quantities and relations while setting aside the qualitative character of experience created a structural gap in the scientific image of the world that can never be closed from within that image. Galileo deliberately excluded secondary qualities, colour, taste, smell, the felt qualities of experience, from his mathematical physics, because they could not be measured and quantified. What could not be measured was not real. This methodological move was extraordinarily productive. It gave us classical mechanics, thermodynamics, electromagnetism, quantum mechanics, general relativity. But it built the explanatory gap into the foundations. If experience is excluded at the start of the scientific description, no amount of science can put it back. You cannot derive a secondary quality from a description that excludes secondary qualities. Goff's proposal, the intrinsic nature of matter, is proto-experiential. The mathematical equations of physics tell us the relational structure of matter, how it behaves, how it interacts, what its causal powers are. They say nothing about what matter is in itself. Panpsychism fills this gap. The intrinsic nature of matter, at every scale, has a proto-experiential character. Not consciousness in any rich sense at the particle level, not the experience of a thought or an emotion, but the ingredient that, in complex organized systems like brains, yields the richness of full conscious experience. Experience is not produced by matter, it is matter seen from the inside. Bertrand Russell had a related insight, developed in his 1927 analysis of matter. Russell pointed out that physics describes the structural and relational properties of matter. What matter does, but not its intrinsic nature. What matter is, the two-place relation, more massive than, is a structural property. The one-place intrinsic character of each relatum is not captured by any relational description. If the intrinsic nature of matter is experiential or proto-experiential, then the structural description of physics is consistent with an experiential intrinsic nature, not in conflict with it. This Russell-Eddington dual aspect proposal, matter has relational structure described by physics and intrinsic character described by phenomenology, is not testable in the same way that physics is testable, but it dissolves the conflict between the scientific and phenomenal descriptions of the world by locating them at different levels of analysis. The main objection to panpsychism is the combination problem. Even if individual particles or simple systems have elementary proto-experiences, it is not obvious how billions of them combine to produce the unified, rich experience of a conscious mind. Classical supervenience can overcome to entanglement. The whole is determined by the properties of the parts and their relations. Holds in classical physics. But experience does not seem to add up classically. My experience of reading this sentence is not the experience of billions of neurons added together and summed. It is a single unified experience irreducible to its components. You cannot get from elementary proto-experiences to unified rich experience by simple addition. Rodolfo Gambini and Jorge Pullin, working in the foundations of quantum gravity, have argued in papers beginning in 2024 that quantum mechanics dissolves the combination problem. Classical supervenience, the whole is determined by the parts, holds in classical physics but is simply false in quantum mechanics. Entangled particles share a joint quantum state that cannot be decomposed into independent states for each particle. The entangled pair has properties that neither particle has separately: non-local correlations, joint causal powers, information that exists only at the level of the whole. When two particles become quantum entangled, the combined system acquires new properties that neither particle possessed independently. If proto-conscious properties are quantum properties, if they combine according to quantum superposition and entanglement rather than classical addition, then the combination of many elementary proto-conscious systems through quantum entanglement yields a unified experience, not predictable from the elements alone. The combination problem dissolves because it rested on a classical assumption about how parts combine into wholes, and that assumption is false in quantum mechanics. The unity of conscious experience is the unity of the entangled quantum state. The parts do not add up, they entangle. This proposal has the virtue of connecting panpsychism to a concrete physical mechanism, quantum entanglement and that is empirically detectable, in principle. If the unity of conscious experience is quantum entanglement of proto-experiential properties, then the brain's conscious states should be characterized by genuine quantum entanglement among their physical substrates, and this entanglement should be present during consciousness and absent or reduced during unconsciousness. The Kerskens-Pérez result tentatively points in exactly this direction. Whether it will survive replication is unknown, but the fact that a testable prediction of panpsychism plus quantum mechanics has been made and a preliminary positive result obtained is not nothing. Part 17. Near-death experiences and the survival hypothesis. A chapter on quantum consciousness and dreaming would be incomplete without addressing the most controversial corner of the field, the phenomenon of near-death experiences and the claim made by some researchers and by Penrose and Hameroff in their more speculative writings that quantum information in microtubules might survive biological death. Near-death experiences are reported by a significant fraction of people who have come close to death by cardiac arrest, severe trauma, or other life-threatening events, and subsequently recovered. The phenomenology is strikingly consistent across cultures, languages, historical periods, and levels of prior belief. A sense of leaving the body and observing it from above, movement through a dark tunnel toward a light, encounters with deceased relatives, a sense of profound peace and love, a panoramic life review, and a boundary beyond which return is not possible. In many cases, people report obtaining veridical information during the out-of-body phase, information about events occurring in the room during their cardiac arrest that they could not have known through normal sensory channels because their eyes were closed and their brain was electrically silent. The scientific study of near-death experiences is genuinely difficult. Pim van Lommel, a cardiologist at Rhine State Hospital in Arnhem, published a prospective study in The Lancet in 2001, following 354 consecutive cardiac arrest survivors. Of these, 62 reported near-death experiences of varying depth. The experiences occurred during periods of cardiac arrest when the heart had stopped, blood pressure was zero, and EEG activity, measured in a subset of patients, was flat. Van Lommel and colleagues argued that the experiences could not be explained by oxygen deprivation, drugs, prior psychological expectations, or the physiological events of resuscitation, because these factors were present in all patients but only some reported experiences. The AWARE study, Awareness During Resuscitation, led by Sam Parnia at New York University, was designed specifically to test the veridical component, whether patients report accurate observations of their resuscitation from a vantage point above the body. Hidden visual targets were placed above resuscitation areas. visible only from an elevated perspective. In the study published in Resuscitation 2014, 2,060 cardiac arrest events were enrolled. 9% of survivors who could be interviewed reported near-death experiences. One patient reported a verified out-of-body experience with accurate observations of the resuscitation procedure, the visual and audio details of the room, and the actions of the medical team. Observations confirmed as accurate by the medical staff. The patient did not see the hidden visual target, but the visual target was not placed in his resuscitation area. The honest assessment, the evidence for near-death experiences as a genuine phenomenon, as experiences occurring during a period when the brain appears clinically inactive, is real and not easily dismissed. The evidence for veridical perception during these experiences, the specifically remarkable claim that the experiencer perceived events accurately from an impossible vantage point during clinical death, is much weaker. Single cases, even thoroughly investigated ones, are insufficient to establish the phenomenon. Memory contamination is a significant confound. The experience may have occurred during the period of recovery, not during the arrest, and the memory may be retrospectively organized to include observations made during partial consciousness. The AWARE study was specifically designed to test this with control stimuli and did not produce definitive evidence for veridical out-of-body perception. Hameroff has speculated that ORC-OR provides a physical framework for understanding what happens to quantum information in microtubules if the brain dies. If quantum information, the specific pattern of quantum states in the microtubule lattice, is encoded in a way that does not depend on the protein being alive, it might in principle persist as quantum information in the surrounding environment after biological death. This is highly speculative and is not a published scientific claim with the same status as the experimental work. Hameroff presents it as a possibility consistent with the theory, not as a prediction of the theory. It requires quantum information to be preserved in a biological environment under conditions, cardiac arrest, tissue ischemia, protein denaturation, that are highly unfavourable to any quantum coherence. The claim is not supported by the experimental evidence and should be evaluated accordingly. What near-death experiences do establish, beyond reasonable doubt, is that profound conscious experiences can occur in circumstances where the brain is severely compromised, whether those experiences occur during the compromised period or in the margins around it, during induction or recovery from clinical death, rather than during death itself, remains scientifically uncertain. The phenomenology is real, its physical substrate is unknown, and the consistency of the phenomenology across the world's cultures and centuries suggests that whatever generates these experiences, it is deeply and reliably embedded in the architecture of the human mind. Part 18. The social stakes of an unsolved question. The question of what consciousness is and what physical systems have it is not merely an academic puzzle. It has direct implications for medicine, ethics, law, and the design of institutions that manage systems whose moral status is uncertain. Recognizing this does not change the science, but it does locate the importance of getting the science right. In clinical medicine, consciousness assessment is one of the most consequential and least certain domains of diagnosis. Patients in the vegetative state, now called disorders of consciousness, show no behavioral signs of awareness, no purposeful movement, no response to commands, no communicative gesture. For decades, this behavioral absence was taken to indicate absent consciousness. The landmark studies of Adrian Owen's group, published in Science in 2006, and subsequently in many follow-up papers, showed that a significant fraction of patients classified behaviorally as vegetative showed unambiguous signs of awareness when assessed with fMRI or EEG. A patient who could not move, blink, or otherwise signal behaviorally could be asked to imagine playing tennis, and the supplementary motor area would activate consistently and reproducibly, exactly as it does in healthy subjects who imagine tennis. The patient was aware the behaviour was absent, the behavioural assessment was wrong. Current estimates, based on multiple studies across multiple sites, suggest that between 15 and 20% of patients classified as vegetative by behavioural criteria are in fact in a minimally conscious state or have intact cognitive function, as revealed by brain imaging. These patients are treated as if unaware. They receive less analgesic medication. They are not consulted about treatment decisions. Their families may be given prognoses based on the assumption of absent consciousness but are incorrect. A reliable, non-behavioral measure of consciousness, a measure of integrated information, or of quantum coherence in microtubule networks, or of any physics-grounded property that reflects genuine consciousness rather than behavioral expression of it, would transform the clinical management of disorders of consciousness. It would also raise the ethical stakes of getting the measurement right. Anesthesia monitoring faces the same problem in the acute setting. General anesthesia aims to produce unconsciousness. The patient should not experience the surgery. Intraoperative awareness, the experience of being conscious during surgery while paralyzed, occurs in approximately 1 to 2 per 1,000 patients undergoing general anesthesia. The incidence sounds low, but given the global volume of surgical procedures, it represents tens of thousands of patients per year experiencing a potentially traumatic event. Current monitoring systems to meter för the bispectral index and similar processed EEG measures reduce but do not eliminate awareness. They measure correlates of consciousness rather than consciousness itself, a direct measure of the physical substrate of consciousness, whether classical or quantum, would be a fundamentally better monitoring tool. Animal welfare raises related issues. The sentience of non-human animals, their capacity to suffer, to experience pain, to have states that matter morally, is recognized in law in many jurisdictions. But the criteria for sentience and the threshold for moral consideration remain poorly defined. Behavioral and neurological criteria are used, but they are proxies. The question of which animals have phi above the threshold for morally significant experience, or which have the relevant quantum dynamics in their neurons, is not currently answerable. But the framing makes clear what kind of question it is, not an ethical question that can be settled by argument, but a scientific question that requires knowing what consciousness is physically before it can be applied to which systems have it. The free will question sits at the intersection of consciousness science and moral philosophy. If conscious experience is quantum, and if quantum processes are genuinely non-deterministic, in the sense that the outcome of a quantum measurement is not determined by prior physical states, only constrained in probability, then conscious decision-making has a genuine stochastic component that is not the same as classical determinism. This is not the same as libertarian free will. Random quantum events are not the same as free choices, but the picture of a genuinely quantum mechanical consciousness making decisions is different from the picture of a classical deterministic brain following the laws of classical physics from initial conditions. Whether this difference matters morally, whether the indeterminism of quantum process grounds a meaningful sense of agency, is a philosophical question that physics alone cannot answer. But the physics does determine which philosophical frameworks are even coherent. Part 19. The frontier, honestly. It is worth sitting with the specific shape of the scientific frontier as it stands in mid-2026, rather than either overselling the progress or retreating to comfortable dismissal. 10 years ago, in 2016, the quantum consciousness theories had essentially no experimental support that the broader scientific community found compelling. The Tegmark calculation was widely treated as decisive. The quantum biology revolution of 2007 onward had been widely acknowledged but treated as irrelevant to neurons. Photosynthetic bacteria and bird retinas are specialized systems, the argument went, and you cannot generalize from them to the warm, chaotic, structurally complex environment of a mammalian neuron. Orcor was a philosophical curiosity with no empirical handle. The neuroscience of consciousness was dominated by global workspace theory, predictive coding, and Bayesian brain frameworks, all of which operated entirely within classical physics and produced genuine empirical predictions that genuine experiments could test. Quantum consciousness was, from the perspective of most working neuroscientists, somewhere between an interesting thought experiment and an embarrassment. By 2026, several things have changed. Quantum exciton effects have been documented in isolated microtubules at room temperature, using rigorous ultra-fast spectroscopy in a peer-reviewed journal co-authored by researchers of unquestioned standing. These effects are sensitive to anesthetic agents at clinically relevant concentrations. This is a specific, quantitative, pharmacologically targeted result. A microtubule stabilizing drug has been shown to delay anesthetic-induced loss of consciousness in living rats in a dose-dependent way. This is an in vivo behavioral results in a living mammal, with a specific pharmacological prediction from OR confirmed. A quantum MRI protocol has produced signals potentially consistent with macroscopic quantum entanglement in waking human brains, correlated with cognitive function and conscious state. In a peer-reviewed publication by credentialed physicists, Bandyopadhyay's group has documented microtubule resonances spanning the full range of brain oscillation frequencies and demonstrated their propagation across neuronal circuits. None of these results is conclusive. Replication is the essential next step, and most of them have not been replicated. The Kerskens-Pérez result in particular needs independent replication with improved controls before it can carry significant weight. The anesthesia results need mechanistic follow-up. Do the pharmacological effects on microtubule quantum dynamics in isolated preparations predict the behavioral effects on anesthetic induction in a quantitatively consistent way? The quantum biology of neurons needs to be characterized at the level of detail now available for photosynthetic complexes, which required over a decade of work by multiple groups using progressively improved methods. That work has not begun in earnest. The history of science offers perspective, the conceptual revolutions that seemed most impossible in advance, the heliocentric solar system, the atomic theory of matter, the evolution of species, quantum mechanics, the double helix, plate tectonics, all went through a phase of being dismissed by the majority of experts before the accumulating evidence forced a reassessment. The dismissal was usually not irrational. At the time, the majority position was supported by the preponderance of evidence, and the revolutionary proposal required setting aside well-confirmed frameworks in favour of something speculative. What made the revolutions happen was not a single decisive experiment. It was the accumulation of experiments that became harder and harder to explain within the existing framework, combined with the development of a new framework that explained them naturally. Quantum consciousness may be in that territory now, a proposal supported by suggestive preliminary evidence, dismissed by the majority, but generating increasingly specific experimental predictions that are being tested with increasingly powerful tools. Or it may be a sophisticated wrong answer that the next decade's experiments will rule out. The honest position is that we do not yet know which it is, and that not knowing which it is the scientific situation, not a failure of scientific ambition. The question is hard. The experiments are in progress. The answer will come from the data. What we can say with confidence: the hard problem of consciousness is real, unsolved, and important. The neural correlates of consciousness have been mapped with extraordinary precision without closing the explanatory gap between physical description and qualitative experience. Quantum biology has established that biological systems exploit quantum effects in warm, wet environments. The specific predictions of OR are testable, and some initial tests are positive. IIT provides a mathematical framework connecting information theory to phenomenology with empirical predictions confirmed across multiple consciousness states. These are the ingredients of a serious scientific program, not a collection of speculations. The program is young, underfunded, contested, and capable of being wrong. It is also capable of being the most important scientific program of the current century. Part 20. What would it mean if we knew? Suppose for a moment that the experiments of the next decade converge on a clear answer. Quantum processes in microtubule networks are the mechanism of consciousness. Quantum entanglement drives integrated information. Objective reduction events constitute moments of experience. The hard problem, while not logically dissolved, has a specific physical answer. Consciousness is what happens when Penrose's gravitationally driven wave function collapse occurs in the organized microtubule lattice of a sufficiently complex biological neural network. What would follow from knowing this? The medical implications are immediate. Every patient in an intensive care unit with an uncertain level of consciousness could, in principle, be assessed with a direct, physics-grounded measurement. The degree of quantum coherence in their cortical microtubule networks, measurable with NV-center quantum sensors or quantum-enhanced MRI, not a behavioral proxy, not an EEG correlate, a direct measurement of the physical substrate. The patient who is clinically vegetative but quantum cortically active is conscious. The patient who shows a flat quantum signature is not. The diagnosis is no longer a judgment call. It is a measurement. The development of anesthetic monitoring would transform. Current consciousness monitors are calibrated against behavioral endpoints and EEG patterns, with the inherent limitation that they measure things correlated with consciousness rather than consciousness itself. A monitor that measures the quantum coherence of microtubule networks in the prefrontal cortex, in the anterior cingulate, in the regions most closely associated with self-awareness and the global workspace, would be a direct monitor of the physical mechanism of conscious experience. The incidence of intraoperative awareness could be reduced to what is limited by sensor sensitivity rather than by the conceptual gap between behavioral correlates and genuine consciousness. The implications for artificial intelligence are profound and practical. If consciousness requires specific quantum physical processes in specific kinds of substrates, then no classical computation, however sophisticated, produces consciousness. Large language models, sophisticated as they are not conscious. This has immediate ethical implications. We need not worry about the moral status of language models, but we may need to begin seriously considering the moral status of quantum computational systems with appropriate architecture, if and when they are developed. The criteria for moral status, for what kind of system deserves moral consideration, would be anchored in physics rather than behavior. This is cleaner in principle and harder in practice, but it is a better problem to have. The implications for our understanding of what we are go deeper. If consciousness is a quantum physical process, if experience is what certain quantum events are from the inside, then the universe has always been conscious in some sense. The proto-experiential character of matter, combined through quantum entanglement in the right architectures, has been generating experience since the first, sufficiently complex quantum systems appeared. We are not the universe becoming conscious by chance. We are the universe's quantum information organizing itself into configurations that experience themselves. The dreaming brain, running its quantum dynamics through the night, uncoupled from external, classical reality, is that process exploring what is possible in the absence of external constraint. The dream is not an illusion or a side effect. It is the quantum substrate of consciousness, finding out what it can generate when left to its own quantum dynamics. It is matter experiencing itself without an external anchor. It may be the most intimate contact we ever have with the physics of our own existence. That is the possibility. It is not proved. The experiments will decide. In the meantime, the dreaming brain continues its nightly exploration, and the sleeping body that contains it lies still, unaware of what physics may be unfolding in its protein lattices, in the dark. Before we go deeper into the quantum physics, it is worth pausing on the neurophysiology of sleep itself, because its details are stranger than most people know, and the strangeness is directly relevant to what quantum processes might be doing during dreaming. Sleep is not rest. That much is now established beyond any serious debate. The sleeping brain is metabolically active at close to waking levels during REM. It is consolidating memories, pruning synaptic connections, clearing metabolic waste products through the glymphatic system. The brain's lymphatic drainage network, first described by Maiken Nedergaard's group at Rochester in 2013, which flows most actively during sleep and removes amyloid beta and tau protein, the aggregates associated with Alzheimer's disease. The sleep-time glymphatic clearance depends on the slow oscillation of non-REM sleep, during which the interstitial space of the brain expands by approximately 60%, allowing cerebrospinal fluid to flush through it. This is not a trivial process. The accumulation of toxic waste products during waking hours and their removal during sleep may be among the primary biological reasons that sleep evolved at all. Any animal that did not sleep would eventually die of metabolic waste toxicity in its own brain. But the glymphatic clearance happens during non-REM sleep. REM sleep has a different agenda. During REM, memory consolidation is not the slow oscillation-driven replay of hippocampal sequences into cortical long-term storage. That is the work of non-REM. REM memory consolidation is associative. It takes recently acquired information and integrates it with distant, older memories, forming creative connections, generalization across examples, emotional context. The work of REM sleep is integration across memory systems rather than stabilization of specific memories. Matthew Walker's group at UC Berkeley has extensively documented this REM-specific associative function. In experiments where subjects learned material and then slept, those who had longer REM sleep showed not just better retention of the learned material, but better ability to extract abstract rules underlying the material, to generalize to new instances, and to find remote associations between separately learned items. A famous study from Walker's group published in 2002 in Nature showed that subjects who had problem-solving insight, the sudden realization of a shortcut in a mathematical task, showed this insight most frequently if they had a full night of sleep between training and testing, rather than a comparable period of waking. REM sleep incubates creative insight. The sleeping brain is not storing experience passively. It is actively rearranging it, finding hidden structure, building new connections between items that were separately encoded. On a quantum consciousness account, this associative function of REM sleep is what quantum computation would produce when run without external classical constraint on a memory system. In waking, memory retrieval is constrained by external context, the current sensory environment, the current task, the current conversation. The associations activated are those contextually appropriate to the immediate classical situation. In REM, without external constraint, the quantum dynamics of the memory system can explore a wider associative space. Quantum superposition allows multiple memory associations to be simultaneously active before collapsing. The collapse selects a specific association, but during the period of superposition, the quantum dynamics of the dreaming memory system traverse a richer landscape than any waking retrieval could access. The associative connections formed during this quantum exploration are what dreamers experience as the narrative logic of dreams. Strange, associative, emotionally resonant, governed by a different principle than waking logic. And they are also what sleepers consolidate as the integrative memory benefit of REM sleep. The bizarre associative logic of dreams may be the phenomenological signature of the brain's quantum memory system doing its deepest work. The theta rhythm is the organizing principle of this process. Theta oscillations, 4 to 8 Hz, are generated by the hippocampal entorhinal system and propagate widely through the cortex during REM. Individual neurons fire at specific phases of the theta cycle, early, middle, or late in the oscillation. The phase of firing encodes information. The same neuron firing at different phases of the theta cycle represents different information, because the theta phase is the clock against which memory sequences are ordered. This phase coding, also called theta phase precession, first described by John O'Keefe and Michael Recchi in CA1 place cells in 1993, is one of the most elegant encoding schemes in neuroscience, and it operates at a timescale, 125 to 250 milliseconds per theta cycle, that is compatible with the microsecond coherence times of quantum processes in microtubules. The relevant quantum dynamics occur and collapse within each theta cycle. The theta rhythm may be the macroscopic organizing framework within which quantum objective reduction events occur and are temporally ordered, building the sequence of moments that constitute dreaming experience. The problem of other minds is one of the oldest challenges in philosophy. How do you know that other people are conscious? You have direct access to your own experience. You have only behavioral evidence about the experiences of others. The inference from observed behavior to postulated inner experience is not logically necessary. It is an inference to the best explanation, and it is unverifiable in principle. Philosophical zombies, beings behaviorally identical to humans, but lacking inner experience, are the thought experiment that makes this vivid. If zombies are conceivable, the behavioral evidence is not sufficient to establish the presence of consciousness. In practice, almost no one is a serious skeptic about other minds. The inference to other minds is so deeply embedded in human social cognition, in the theory of mind capacities that develop in children around age 4, in the automatic attribution of mental states to faces and voices and bodies that is characteristic of normal human social processing, that entertaining serious skepticism about it requires a kind of deliberate, philosophical effort that most people never undertake. The pragmatic question is not whether other humans are conscious, but how to build institutions and practices that respect their consciousness appropriately. The quantum consciousness framework transforms this practically. If consciousness is a specific physical property, the presence of quantum coherent dynamics in organized biological substrates, or integrated information above a threshold, or both, then the question, is this other system conscious, becomes, in principle, empirically answerable. It is no longer merely an inference from behavior. It is a physical measurement. The system either has the relevant quantum properties or it does not. The moral status of the system follows from the physical measurement, not from the behavioral inference. This has implications for some of the most contested moral questions of the current moment. Is a fetus conscious? And at what developmental stage? When the cortex begins to develop its quantum-relevant architecture, when the microtubule networks of cortical neurons reach the density and organization required for OR processes, that is when, on the OR account, the onset of consciousness occurs. Whether this happens at 10 weeks, 20 weeks, or 30 weeks of gestation is not a philosophical or political question on this account. It is a neurodevelopmental question with a physical answer. Measuring the quantum properties of the developing fetal cortex across gestational age would, in principle, provide the answer. The same applies to non-human animals. The question of whether fish feel pain, whether octopuses have subjective experience, whether insects have any form of inner life. These questions have been addressed by behavioral and neural structural criteria, with results that remain contested. A physics-grounded criterion, the presence of quantum dynamics in neural tissue, organized in ways compatible with OR, would provide a principled answer. Whether the answer will match our intuitions about which animals deserve moral consideration is unknowable in advance. It might expand the circle of moral concern dramatically. It might contract it in ways that surprise us. The physics does not care about our intuitions. The measurement will tell us what it tells us. These are not hypothetical future questions. They are live policy questions in multiple jurisdictions right now, with real stakes for real beings, being answered on inadequate grounds because the scientific foundation for answering them is not yet established. The urgency of building that foundation is, in part, a moral urgency. Getting the science right about consciousness matters, for the same reason that getting any foundational science right matters. The policy and ethics built on wrong foundations will cause harm that correct foundations would prevent. The stakes of the quantum consciousness research program are not merely philosophical. They are, in a real sense, civilizational. The cross-cultural universality of dreaming is itself evidence about its biological basis. Every human culture, in the historical and anthropological record, has a rich account of dreaming. The content varies: what dreams mean, where they come from, whether they connect the dreamer to ancestors, or the divine or the future. But the phenomenology is remarkably consistent. Vivid visual and auditory experience, emotional intensity, narrative that is internally coherent but externally bizarre, and the transition to waking that erases most of the content. These features are recognized across the full span of human diversity. The ancient Egyptians built an elaborate practice of dream incubation, sleeping in sacred temples to receive divine communications through dreams. The Edwin Smith surgical papyrus, dating to around 1600 BCE, contains references to dream interpretation alongside medical instructions, treating dream content as diagnostically significant. The Greeks had a tradition of incubation at the sanctuaries of Asclepius, the god of medicine. Ill pilgrims would sleep in the abaton, the sacred sleeping hall, hoping to dream of a cure, or of Asclepius himself prescribing a treatment. Sanctuaries at Epidaurus and Kos attracted pilgrims for centuries. The reported cures, some of which presumably involved genuinely effective suggestions received in the dream state, sustained the tradition for half a millennium. The earliest systematic analysis of dream content appears in Artemidorus of Daldis, a 2nd century CE Greek writer, whose 5-volume Oneira Critica remains the most extensive ancient treatment of dream interpretation. Artemidorus distinguished between symbolic dreams, whose meaning was metaphorical and required interpretation, and theorematic dreams, which showed the dreamer directly what would happen. He collected dreams from across the Greek-speaking world, cataloguing their imagery and outcomes. His taxonomy is sophisticated. He recognized that the same dream symbol meant different things in different emotional contexts for different dreamers at different points in their lives. Context is everything. The dream is the product of the dreamer. Indigenous traditions across the Americas have elaborate practices for working with dreams. The Iroquois Confederacy had an institution of dream guessing, in which community members would interpret a dreamer's expressed desires that appeared in disguised form in the dream, and collectively work to satisfy them, in the belief that frustrated dream desires would produce illness. The Sinoi people of the Malay Peninsula, whose dream work practices were widely discussed in the 1970s, after being described by Kilton Stuart, were reported to train children from an early age to influence their dreams, to confront and overcome threatening dream figures, and to bring creative products back from the dream state. The accuracy of Stuart's ethnographic account has been questioned, but the attention to dream phenomenology as a domain of practice and cultivation is itself culturally significant. In the Abrahamic traditions, dreaming as a site of divine communication is thoroughly documented. Joseph's interpretations of the Pharaoh's dreams in the book of Genesis, Daniel's interpretation of Nebuchadnezzar's dream in the book of Daniel, the angel's announcement to Joseph of Mary's pregnancy in Matthew's Gospel, prophetic dreams are embedded in the narrative foundation of all three traditions. The Prophet Muhammad reportedly received some of the earliest Quranic revelations in a state between sleeping and waking. The oniric tradition in Islamic mysticism, particularly in Sufi accounts of ruya, the veridical dream, treats dream experience as a legitimate mode of spiritual knowledge. What does this cross-cultural universality tell us? At minimum, it tells us that the phenomenology of dreaming is consistent enough across human biology and culture that every human tradition has found it worth theorizing, institutionalizing, and building practices around. Dreams are, for virtually every human culture, real. They may be metaphorical, they may be predictive, they may be communications from ancestors or gods, or the unconscious. The interpretive frameworks vary enormously, but the experiences themselves are taken seriously as experiences. They have content that matters. They are worth attending to. From a quantum consciousness perspective, this universality is expected. If dreaming is what a quantum biological process produces when freed from external classical constraint, then dreaming is universal, because the quantum biology is universal. All neurotypical human brains have microtubule-dense neurons, have REM sleep with characteristic aminergic withdrawal and cholinergic rise, have the same closed-loop condition during REM that removes external classical anchoring. The diversity of cultural interpretations is the diversity of frameworks imposed on a common underlying physical experience. The experience itself, vivid, bizarre, emotionally charged, narratively coherent by its own logic, mostly forgotten on waking, is the same everywhere because the physics is the same everywhere. The dream is the quantum substrate of consciousness, universally. The interpretation of the dream is culture. The physics does not care about the interpretation. There is a technical detail in the mathematics of IIT that is worth understanding for what it implies about the relationship between quantum physics and the measure of consciousness. Phi, as Tononi defines it, is a measure of irreducibility, the degree to which a system cannot be partitioned into independent subsystems without losing information about its causal structure. Computing phi exactly is computationally intractable for systems larger than a few dozen elements. It requires evaluating all possible partitions of the system and finding the one that loses the least information. For a system of 100 neurons, the number of possible partitions is astronomical. For the human brain, exact phi computation is beyond any foreseeable calculation. This is not merely a practical limitation, it tells us something deep about the relationship between consciousness and complexity. A system with genuinely high phi, a system where the whole is substantially more informationally rich than any partition of its parts, is a system that cannot be understood or simulated by dividing it into components and simulating each component separately. You must simulate the whole. There is no shortcut. The consciousness of such a system is not reducible to the operation of its parts, not because of some mysterious additional ingredient, but because the information structure of the whole is mathematically irreducible to the information structures of the parts. Consciousness in IIT is the measure of this irreducibility, and genuine irreducibility in a physical system may require quantum entanglement rather than classical correlation. Classical correlations between subsystems, correlations that arise from a shared history or a common cause, can always be described in terms of local hidden variables. The correlations between the two parts of a classically correlated system can always, in principle, be accounted for by a joint probability distribution over the states of the parts separately. This means the system, despite its correlations, can in principle be decomposed The information of the whole can be recovered from a description of the parts plus a description of their joint probability distribution. This is not a partition that loses information. It is a complete description that separates naturally. Quantum entanglement is different in kind. Entangled quantum systems have correlations that cannot be described by any local hidden variable model. Bell's theorem, proved in 1964 and confirmed experimentally by Alain Aspect in 1982, and more definitively by Henson and colleagues in a loophole-free test in 2015, demonstrates that the correlations of entangled quantum systems violate Bell inequalities that any local hidden variable theory must satisfy. The violations are real. They have been confirmed in dozens of experiments under conditions that close successively more potential loopholes. Quantum entanglement is not a correlation that can be accounted for by a joint probability distribution over local hidden variables. It is a genuinely different kind of correlation, one that is non-local in a way that classical correlations cannot be. What this means for phi, an entangled quantum system, has a form of integration, a form of irreducibility that no classical system can achieve. The partition of an entangled quantum system into its subsystems necessarily destroys information. The entangled state cannot be recovered from descriptions of the subsystems separately, because the correlations among them are non-local and cannot be captured in any local description. If phi measures the irreducibility of a system's causal structure, then quantum entanglement provides a form of irreducibility that is physically deeper than anything achievable by classical means. A brain whose neural populations are quantum entangled is more irreducible, has higher phi in a physically grounded sense, than any classical brain of the same architecture could be. Quantum entanglement is the physical substrate of maximal integration, and maximal integration is, in IIT, maximal consciousness. The measurement problem in quantum mechanics makes this connection more intimate. When a quantum system is measured, the measurement collapses the joint quantum state of the system and the measuring apparatus. Before the measurement, the system and the apparatus are entangled. They share a joint quantum state that cannot be separated into independent states for each. After the measurement, the entanglement is resolved into a definite classical outcome. The collapse event is the resolution of entanglement. And the resolution of entanglement, the moment when the joint quantum state becomes a classical definite state, is, on the Orc-OR account, the moment of conscious experience. Consciousness is what the resolution of entanglement is from the inside, the non-local integration of the entangled state. Experience from within is the unity of conscious experience. The collapse of the entangled state to a definite classical outcome. Experience from within is the definiteness of the present moment. The mathematics of quantum mechanics and the phenomenology of consciousness are, on this picture, two descriptions of the same physical process. If dreaming is the quantum substrate of consciousness doing its most unconstrained work, exploring a wider space of associative possibilities, consolidating memory through quantum coherent processes, running the quantum computation that is experienced without the classical anchor of external sensory data, then the cost of sleep deprivation goes deeper than fatigue. The effects of sleep deprivation on cognition are well documented and severe. Acute total sleep deprivation for 24 hours produces cognitive impairment comparable to a blood alcohol concentration of 0.10%, above the legal driving limit in most jurisdictions. Attention lapses become frequent, reaction time slows, working memory capacity drops, emotional regulation deteriorates. The prefrontal cortex, which requires deep sleep for optimal restoration of its synaptic efficiency, is among the first regions to show functional deficit. The person who has not slept is functionally compromised in ways they typically do not recognize. Another prefrontal deficit, the failure to accurately assess one's own impairment. Chronic partial sleep deprivation, sleeping 6 hours a night for 2 weeks, produces cognitive impairment comparable to 2 or 3 days of total sleep deprivation, but without the same subjective experience of sleepiness. People who chronically undersleep adapt to their impairment, normalize it, and cease to recognize it as impairment. They feel less sleepy than their performance would predict. The brain is adjusting its subjective experience of alertness downward to match the objective state, while the cognitive impairment persists. Matthew Walker's laboratory has documented these effects with careful controls over multiple studies. The conclusion is stark. There is no evidence that the human brain adapts beneficially to chronic sleep restriction. You do not get used to less sleep. You simply become impaired without realizing it. The quantum consciousness perspective adds a dimension to this picture. Each night of sleep is not just a maintenance window for the biological machinery. It is the window in which the quantum computational substrate of consciousness runs its unconstrained exploration, integrates its memories associatively, and constitutes the portion of the stream of consciousness that occurs without external classical anchoring. Depriving the brain of this window does not merely accumulate fatigue, it deprives the quantum substrate of the time it requires to consolidate, integrate, and, on the Orc-core account, develop the organized quantum coherence that serves waking consciousness. The rested brain brings to waking not just restored neurotransmitter levels and cleared waste products, but a quantum computational substrate that has completed a full cycle of unconstrained exploration and returned to the classical waking state, with whatever the quantum dynamics produced during the night. The relationship between chronic sleep deprivation and Alzheimer's disease is increasingly documented. The glymphatic system's clearance of amyloid beta and tau during sleep is disrupted by sleep deprivation, allowing these proteins to accumulate. But there may be an additional quantum dimension. If organized quantum coherence in microtubule networks requires the specific neurochemical conditions of REM sleep to develop and maintain, then chronic deprivation of REM may disrupt the quantum architecture of the cortical microtubule system in ways that accelerate its degradation. The microtubule dysfunction that is characteristic of Alzheimer's disease, tau protein aggregating into neurofibrillary tangles, disrupting microtubule structure and transport, may be both a cause and an effect of disrupted quantum coherence in the affected neurons. The direction of causation is not established, but the connection between sleep, microtubule health, and cognitive function in aging is a domain where quantum consciousness theory and practical neuromedicine converge. None of this changes the practical advice. Sleep more, sleep consistently, protect REM sleep in the second half of the night, when REM episodes are longest and deepest. Avoid alcohol before sleep, which suppresses REM dramatically, and recognize chronic sleep restriction as the impairment it is, rather than the productivity strategy it is often marketed as. The quantum dimension does not change the recommendation, it deepens the rationale. What you are protecting when you protect your sleep is not just your biological machinery. You are protecting the nightly access of your quantum computational substrate to its unconstrained mode. You are protecting the dreaming brain's time. The relationship between dreaming and creativity is one of the most consistently documented and least explained phenomena in the psychology of cognition. The chemist August Kerskens-Pérez reported in an 1865 address to the German Chemical Society that he had arrived at the ring structure of benzene, one of the foundational insights of organic chemistry, through a dream in which a snake seized its own tail. Whether the story is apocryphal or accurate, the structure of benzene is a ring, and the insight that resolved a long controversy in structural chemistry was, in Kerskens' own account, reached through hypnagogic imagery. Dmitry Mendeleev reported that the arrangement of elements in the periodic table came to him in a dream. Paul McCartney has consistently reported that the melody of Yesterday, eventually the most covered song in popular music history, arrived complete in a dream, and that his first waking act was to find a piano to capture it before it was forgotten. The mechanisms proposed by classical neuroscience for dream creativity are real and are not disputed. REM sleep's associative consolidation links distant memories across the network, finding unexpected connections between items encoded separately. The offline mode of REM, freed from the demands of external task performance, released from the prefrontal executive control that normally prunes associative spreading to the task-relevant subset, allows a wider associative search. The emotional salience assigned by the amygdala during REM highlights connections that carry emotional relevance rather than logical necessity. These are genuine cognitive mechanisms of creative incubation, documented in sleep laboratory experiments by Walker, Stickgold, Hobson, and many others. The quantum consciousness perspective adds a deeper layer to this account. If the dreaming brain is running quantum computation, unconstrained by external classical anchoring, then the creative insights it generates are not merely the result of wider classical associative search. They are the result of quantum superposition, across a space of possibilities that the classical dreaming neuroscience would not predict. The quantum dreaming brain does not search the associative network sequentially or even in parallel classical threads. It holds multiple possible connections in quantum superposition, allowing them to interfere constructively or destructively before collapsing to the most coherent outcome. The creative insight is the result of genuine quantum computation, the exploitation of quantum interference to find the association that a classical search, however wide, would be unlikely to locate. Kerskens' snake is quantum interference selecting the ring structure from a superposition of molecular configurations. McCartney's melody is quantum coherence, resolving a musical superposition into the specific sequence that satisfies the most simultaneous constraints. The insight feels like it arrives from outside, unbidden and complete, because it is not the product of a sequential classical search. It is the product of quantum collapse. This prediction has a testable implication. If creative insight during dreaming involves genuine quantum computation, quantum superposition, and interference rather than classical search, then the quality of creative insight should correlate with the degree of quantum coherence in the dreaming cortex during the relevant dream period, not merely with the breadth of associative spreading. Measuring quantum coherence directly during sleep and correlating it with post-sleep creative performance on problems requiring remote associative insight would distinguish the quantum account from the classical account. No such experiment has been done because the tools to measure quantum coherence in sleeping human brains are only now being developed. It is a precise prediction, waiting for the instruments to test it. The practical implication is what every artist and scientist already knows intuitively: sleep on it. Not as a cliché, but as a description of a real process. The problem that is intractable in the afternoon may resolve overnight, not because you have forgotten it and gained perspective, not only because associative memory has had time to spread, but because the quantum computational substrate of your consciousness has spent the night exploring a richer space of possible solutions than your waking mind can access. The sleeping brain is working on your behalf in a way that your waking brain cannot replicate. It is worth giving it the time it needs. Tonight, when you sleep, your brain will do something that no theory fully explains. The brainstem will signal. The thalamus will relay. The pons will send its PGO waves cascading into the visual cortex. The aminergic systems will quiet, and the cholinergic systems will rise. The hippocampus will replay the day's patterns, faces and places, conversations and images, things learned and half-learned, and these replays will arrive in a cortex already generating its own activity. And the combination will produce a world, not the world. A world constructed entirely from within, constrained by memory, shaped by emotion, organized by theta oscillations cycling at 5 to 8 times per second through the hippocampal entorhinal loop and on into the cortex, given its vividness by the visual cortex firing to signals it generates rather than receives, dramatized by the amygdala's continuous presence, unchallenged by a prefrontal cortex that has, for the duration, gone quiet. What is happening in your microtubules during this time is unknown. Whether quantum superpositions are building up across your tubulin lattices, whether objective reduction events are occurring at a rate that corresponds to the rhythm of your dreaming consciousness, whether the binding of dream images into their strange unified strangeness reflects quantum entanglement, unconstrained by external reality, we do not know. The instruments that could tell us are being built. The experiments that could answer the question are being designed. The people who could run them are alive right now, working in laboratories, reading the preprints, arguing at conferences about exactly this. Within the decade, we will know more than we know now. But here is what does not change regardless of what the experiments find. The experience of the dream was real. Whatever its physical substrate, whether it runs on classical biochemistry or quantum gravitational events in protein lattices, the dream was experienced. The world it contained was the world available to the person inside it. The faces, the impossible architecture, the emotional weight of something unnameable, the conversations with people who are gone. All of it constituted a moment of consciousness, as genuine as this one. There is no fact about neural mechanism that makes experience more real or less real. Experience is what it is. When you wake, the theta rhythms slow. The aminergic systems reactivate. The prefrontal cortex comes back online, The sensory gates reopen, and the external world asserts itself with its definite objects, and its stable physics, and its demand that you be a specific person in a specific room with a specific history. Most of the night's experience evaporates. The brain does not encode dream experience in the same hippocampal circuits that serve waking memory, for reasons involving the timing of memory consolidation relative to the theta-driven replay cycles, the very replay that may have constituted the dream's time in the first place. The consciousness was there, the trace is almost nothing. But for those hours, the most sophisticated physical object in the known universe was running in a closed loop, building experience from within, generating a world without a world, conscious inside itself, cut off from the external classical anchor, running whatever the quantum dynamics of an unconstrained biological brain can run when the world's continuous classical measurement is removed. We are the universe trying to understand what it is like to be the universe. The dreaming brain, turned inward and cut off from the world, running on its own dynamics through the dark, is that project running without external constraint. Awareness happening in the space that the physics opens when the classical constraint lifts. A consciousness generating experience without a ground truth to anchor it, and finding that the experience, untethered from the world, is no less real for being so. Perhaps more vivid, perhaps more itself. The hard problem is still there, the experiments are running. The question of what consciousness is, and what dreaming is, and whether the physics that governs both is classical or quantum, or something that will require a third framework that does not yet exist. These questions are open, and they are important, and the tools to answer them are becoming available for the first time in history. We are asking with genuine scientific seriousness what it means that matter arranges itself into a configuration that experiences its own existence. We are building the instruments to look. We're learning to ask the question with precision. That is not a small thing. It may be the most important thing we are doing. Sleep well. The question will be here when you wake up.